When Christopher Nolan returned to Gotham City in 2008, he was not simply making a sequel, he was completing an argument he had begun 3 years earlier with Batman Begins. That film had already broken from the campy, stylized tradition that dominated superhero cinema in the 1990s, grounding Bruce Wayne's origin in psychological trauma, urban decay, and a plausible, if heightened, version of criminal justice. The Dark Knight extends that logic to its furthest point, asking what happens when a vigilante's presence doesn't simply suppress crime but provokes a more sophisticated, ideological form of it. Warner Brothers had every commercial incentive to follow up on the goodwill generated by Batman Begins, but the studio's ambitions and Nolan's artistic instincts aligned around something riskier than a conventional cash-in, a film that would treat its comic book source material as raw material for a crime saga in the tradition of Michael Mann's Heat, rather than as an excuse for spectacle alone. This tonal commitment is what separates The Dark Knight from nearly every superhero film that preceded it, and it explains why the film continues to be treated as a dividing line in the genre's history. Before it, superhero movies were largely understood as adaptations that needed to honor or reinterpret their source material's fantastical elements. After it, a significant portion of the genre reoriented itself around realism, moral ambiguity, and a grounded aesthetic, even when such an approach sat uneasily with the inherent implausibility of a man dressed as a bat fighting crime. The film's DNA can be traced through countless attempts, some successful, many not, to replicate its combination of gravity and entertainment. Developing the story, Harvey Dent as the true protagonist. One of the more counterintuitive choices in the film's construction, and one that rewards close attention, is that its emotional and structural center is not Bruce Wayne but Harvey Dent, the idealistic district attorney whose descent into vengeful nihilism as Two-Face gives the film its tragic architecture. Nolan and David Goyer, who had shaped the narrative backbone of Batman Begins together, recognized that Batman's arc was already substantially resolved. He had accepted his mission, established his methods, and begun his war on organized crime. What remained dramatically fertile was the question of what corruption looks like when it doesn't announce itself as villainy but instead emerges from betrayed idealism. Dent's function in the screenplay is to embody the version of heroism that Gotham consciously wants and can psychologically accept, a lawful, photogenic, elected champion, in contrast to Batman, who represents the heroism the city needs but cannot officially endorse. The film's now famous closing formulation, in which Batman accepts blame for Dent's crimes so that the city can keep its faith in an incorruptible symbol, only works because the screenplay spends its middle act meticulously building Dent as someone worth mourning. His transformation into Two-Face is not a simple switch but a logical culmination of specific losses, the death of Rachel Dawes, disfigurement, and the Joker's patient psychological manipulation. That the story's most devastating character arc belongs to a supporting player rather than the title hero is a structural risk that pays off precisely because the film treats Dent's fall as the human cost of the ideological war being waged around him. Writing influences, comics, crime cinema, and realism. The screenplay's texture draws heavily from a specific vein of 1980s Batman comics that reimagined the character in more psychologically complex and morally ambiguous terms, moving away from the campier tonal register of earlier decades. This lineage gave the Nolans permission to treat the Joker not as a garish trickster but as something closer to a philosophical provocateur, a character whose chaos has an argument embedded in it. Equally important to the film's tone were crime dramas concerned with the mechanics of organized institutions under stress, stories where procedure, bureaucracy, and moral compromise are as dramatically significant as any action sequence. This hybridization is why The Dark Knight often plays less like a superhero adventure and more like an ensemble crime picture that happens to include a man in a bat costume. Extended sequences devoted to money laundering, mob hierarchies, police corruption, and prosecutorial strategy would feel out of place in most comic book adaptations, yet here they form the connective tissue that makes the film's larger set pieces feel earned rather than arbitrary. The realism Nolan pursued was never meant to be literal. Gotham remains a heightened, semi-fictional space, but the internal logic of its institutions behaves according to recognizable rules, which is part of why the film's moral dilemmas land with such force. Casting and the weight of performance. The ensemble Nolan assembled reflects the film's ambition to be taken seriously as drama rather than as spectacle alone. Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne continues to carry the internal conflict established in the previous film, but here it deepens into exhaustion. This is a Batman worn down by the impossibility of his self-appointed burden, increasingly aware that heroism might require permanent sacrifice rather than eventual reward. Michael Caine's Alfred and Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox provide the film's moral ballast, articulating boundaries that Bruce is tempted to cross, particularly around surveillance technology and the ethics of extraordinary measures taken in the name of security. Aaron Eckhart's performance as Harvey Dent is frequently underappreciated relative to the film's other acting achievements, yet it is essential. He has to be believable as an inspiring public figure before he can be devastating as a broken one, and the specificity of his physical and vocal transformation after his disfigurement sells the tragedy without tipping into melodrama. Maggie Gyllenhaal, replacing Katie Holmes as Rachel Dawes, brings a firmer presence to a character whose death drives much of the plot's emotional consequence. Gary Oldman's Commissioner Gordon remains the film's most quietly heroic figure, a family man and institutional actor whose incorruptibility is tested through pragmatic compromise rather than dramatic temptation. And then there is Heath Ledger's Joker, a performance that has become inseparable from any discussion of the film. Ledger approached the character not as a comic villain but as an agent of pure ideological chaos, someone with no discernible backstory that can be trusted, no consistent motive beyond dismantling the moral certainties of everyone around him. His vocal choices, physical tics, and unpredictable rhythm made the character feel genuinely dangerous in a way few screen villains manage, and the performance's improvisational texture gave scenes an unstable energy that kept audiences off balance. Ledger's death in January 2008, months before the film's release, transformed the anticipation surrounding his performance into something more solemn. What might have been ordinary pre-release buzz became laced with the knowledge that audiences were about to witness a final, complete piece of work from an actor who would not be able to build on it. The posthumous recognition that followed, including major acting awards, marked an unusual moment in which a genre film's supporting performance was treated with the same seriousness typically reserved for prestige drama. Production philosophy, practical effects and IMAX ambition. Nolan's approach to filmmaking on The Dark Knight reflected a broader philosophy that has come to define his career, a preference for tangible, camera-capturable reality over digital fabrication wherever feasible. The production's willingness to physically flip an 18-wheeler truck and detonate a real building rather than rely on computer-generated substitutes gave the film's action sequences a texture and weight that audiences could sense even without consciously identifying why the effects felt different from typical blockbuster spectacle. This commitment extended to the film's use of large-format IMAX cameras, an ambitious and at the time unprecedented choice for a mainstream narrative feature. Sequences shot in this format expanded the aspect ratio dramatically during projection, giving Gotham's skyline and the film's action set pieces an immersive scale that reinforced the film's ambitions toward operatic seriousness. Shooting across Chicago, which stood in for Gotham's urban geography, along with location work in Hong Kong and studio work in England, gave the production a genuinely international scope while maintaining a consistent visual identity anchored in real architecture and recognizable urban textures rather than obviously constructed sets. This grounding in tangible locations reinforced the film's thematic interest in institutions, city government, police infrastructure, financial systems, as believable structures under strain rather than backdrop. Marketing as narrative extension. The film's promotional campaign broke from conventional blockbuster marketing by constructing an elaborate alternate reality game that invited audiences into Gotham's fiction well before the film's release. Much of this campaign initially served a defensive purpose. Significant skepticism had greeted the announcement that Ledger, known primarily for dramatic and romantic roles, would be playing a character so thoroughly associated with Jack Nicholson's earlier, more theatrical interpretation. The interactive campaign worked to reframe expectations, seeding an atmosphere of unease and unpredictability that mirrored the character himself, turning viral marketing into an extension of the film's tonal world rather than a separate advertising exercise. Following Ledger's death, this same campaign's momentum shifted into an unplanned but powerful current of public mourning and anticipation, with audiences approaching the film's eventual release with a mixture of excitement and something closer to reverence. Commercial triumph and its significance. The film's box office performance upon release was extraordinary by any measure, and its financial success mattered beyond the studio ledger. It demonstrated that a mainstream tentpole could pursue genuine moral complexity, a self-consciously downbeat ending, and a villain whose ideology offered no comfortable resolution, while still achieving historic commercial reach. This combination, critical and popular success paired with thematic ambition, gave subsequent studios confidence to fund similarly serious-minded genre films, even though many such attempts would struggle to replicate the specific alchemy that made The Dark Knight work. Its box office dominance in its release year, and its place among the highest-grossing films of its era at the time, cemented the notion that audiences would reward, rather than resist, a superhero film willing to behave like a tragedy. Themes: terrorism, chaos, and the limits of ethical action. Released in the shadow of post-9/11 anxieties about security, surveillance, and the moral compromises democracies make when confronting existential threats, The Dark Knight functions as an allegory, deliberately imprecise rather than didactic, for the war on terror. The Joker operates less like a traditional criminal seeking profit or power than like an ideological actor whose goal is to expose the fragility of civilized order, to prove that any society's moral structure will collapse under sufficient pressure. His schemes are designed as experiments, forcing ordinary citizens to choose between their own survival and someone else's, testing whether Harvey Dent's incorruptibility is a durable trait or a circumstantial luxury, daring Batman to break his one rule against killing. Batman's response to this provocation is where the film's ethical argument becomes most interesting. Rather than simply defeating the Joker through superior force, Batman is repeatedly forced into morally compromising positions, employing invasive surveillance technology across the entire city's cell phones, for instance, that mirror exactly the kind of overreach the Joker is trying to provoke. The film does not offer easy vindication for these choices. Lucius Fox's discomfort with the surveillance system, and his insistence that it be destroyed once its immediate purpose is served, signals that the narrative recognizes the danger in normalizing extraordinary measures even when deployed by a trusted actor. This refusal to fully endorse its hero's methods is part of what elevates the film above simple power fantasy. It treats the exercise of power, even virtuous power, as something requiring constant ethical scrutiny rather than blind trust. The film's conclusion, in which Batman takes responsibility for Dent's crimes to preserve the public's faith in Gotham's institutions, crystallizes this thematic project. It suggests that a functioning society sometimes requires protective myths, that people need to believe in incorruptible symbols even when the truth is more complicated, while simultaneously acknowledging the loneliness and moral cost borne by whoever chooses to become the necessary lie. Batman's willingness to be hated rather than let Gotham lose its faith is framed as heroic, but it is a specifically melancholic form of heroism, one that finds little celebration in its own sacrifice. Upon release, the film was celebrated for its tonal seriousness, technical craftsmanship, and ensemble performances, with particular attention paid to Ledger's work as a career-defining, tragically final achievement. Over time, critical and scholarly engagement with the film has only deepened, with extended analysis devoted to its treatment of surveillance ethics, its allegorical relationship to contemporary geopolitics, and its meticulous construction of Harvey Dent's fall from grace as a study in how idealism curdles into extremism when subjected to sufficient trauma. Its selection for preservation by the Library of Congress in the National Film Registry, an honor reserved for works deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, reflects the extent to which the film has moved beyond its origins as a summer blockbuster into the realm of films treated as historically important texts. Legacy, the blueprint problem. Perhaps no aspect of the film's legacy is more consequential, or more double-edged, than its status as a template. Because The Dark Knight demonstrated that grounded realism, moral ambiguity, and a muted color palette could coexist with commercial success, it prompted a wave of imitators eager to replicate its gravity, sometimes without understanding the specific narrative and thematic groundwork that made that gravity earned rather than merely aesthetic. Grittiness became, for a period, a default mode for adapting comic book material, regardless of whether a given story or character actually benefited from that treatment. The uneven results of this imitation wave have, somewhat paradoxically, only reinforced how difficult it is to replicate what Nolan's film achieved. It wasn't darkness for its own sake that made The Dark Knight work, but the disciplined integration of that darkness into a coherent moral and dramatic argument. The film's trilogy concluded 4 years later with The Dark Knight Rises, which attempted to resolve the thematic questions posed by its predecessor while closing out Bruce Wayne's arc. Whatever one's assessment of that concluding chapter, it operated permanently in the shadow of The Dark Knight's achievement, a reminder of how thoroughly the middle film had redefined audience expectations for what a Batman story, and by extension a superhero story, could be. Conclusion. The Dark Knight endures not because it is a superhero film that happens to be well made, but because it uses its genre framework to interrogate questions that genre framework typically avoids: the fragility of civic trust, the moral cost of extraordinary power, and the psychological mechanics by which idealism can be weaponized into its opposite. Its combination of technical ambition, structural daring in centering Harvey Dent's tragedy, and a performance from Heath Ledger that reoriented what villainy could look like on screen, produced a film whose influence has proven far easier to invoke than to successfully reproduce. Nearly 2 decades after its release, it remains a reference point not just for superhero cinema but for a broader question about how popular entertainment can carry serious ethical weight without abandoning the pleasures that make it popular in the first place. The heist that opens The Dark Knight is doing far more narrative work than establishing a new villain's cunning. A crew of masked men rob a mafia-controlled bank, and one by one they kill each other on the Joker's own instructions, each unaware that his partner has been told to eliminate him once his usefulness expires. The last man standing, revealed as the Joker himself, walks away with the entire haul. Structurally, this sequence functions as a thesis statement for everything that follows. It demonstrates, in miniature, the Joker's signature method of turning cooperation into self-destruction, of engineering situations where people betray each other not because they are inherently corrupt but because they have been placed inside a system engineered to reward betrayal. Every major set piece in the film that follows, the interrogation, the hospital gambit, the ferry dilemma, repeats this same structural logic on a larger scale. The bank heist is not simply an introduction to a new criminal, it is a compressed rehearsal of the entire film's argument about how thin the membrane is between order and chaos when the right pressure is applied. It also establishes something crucial about the Joker's relationship to money and material gain, which is that he has none. He orchestrates an elaborate, lethal heist and later, when he has the opportunity to claim a vast mob fortune, chooses to burn it rather than keep it. This detail, which recurs later in the film, tells the audience early on not to interpret the Joker through the familiar lens of criminal self-interest. He is not a rival gang boss competing for territory or wealth. He operates according to a different calculus entirely, one where destruction and demonstration matter more than accumulation. Understanding this distinction is essential to understanding why the alliance Batman, Dent, and Gordon form to fight organized crime proves so inadequate to the threat that actually emerges. The alliance and its blind spot. Batman, Harvey Dent, and Jim Gordon forming an implicit partnership to dismantle Gotham's organized crime networks represents the culmination of the vision established in Batman Begins, a coordinated, three-pronged assault on corruption using vigilante action, legitimate prosecution, and honest policing simultaneously. Each man occupies a different position relative to the law, Batman entirely outside it, Dent as its most visible champion, Gordon as its most trustworthy internal enforcer, and their cooperation suggests that Gotham's redemption might be achievable through this combination of forces working in concert rather than any single method alone. Bruce Wayne's personal investment in Dent's success adds a layer of dramatic irony that deepens as the film progresses. Bruce publicly champions Dent specifically because he believes Dent's legitimate, photogenic heroism might eventually make Batman unnecessary, allowing Bruce to retire from vigilantism and pursue an ordinary life, including a romantic future with Rachel Dawes. This hope is quietly devastating in retrospect, because the audience knows from the outset that Rachel has already chosen to stay with Dent rather than wait for Bruce, and because the entire premise of Bruce's hope, that Dent represents a sustainable, legitimate alternative to Batman, will be dismantled by the same film that sets it up. The Alliance's blind spot is precisely this: all three men are prepared to fight organized crime as a structural, institutional problem, but none of them are prepared for an adversary whose entire purpose is to prove that institutions and individual virtue alike will collapse under sufficiently engineered pressure. The mob summit and the miscalculation of hiring chaos. When Gotham's crime bosses convene to discuss the mounting threats to their operations, simultaneous pressure from the police, from Batman, and from the exposure of their finances through the fleeing accountant Lau, their gathering represents the old guard of Gotham crime attempting to respond to modernity using traditional criminal logic, negotiation, hierarchy, and transactional problem-solving. The Joker's interruption of this meeting, and his brazen offer to kill Batman in exchange for half of the mob's remaining fortune, is a masterstroke of dramatic irony that the film handles with real precision. The bosses, still thinking in terms of assets and market share, treat the Joker as a service provider, a specialist they can hire and, implicitly, discard once he has served his purpose. They fail to recognize that they are not hiring a hitman but inviting an agent of pure disorder into the center of their operation, one who has no interest in preserving their business model even temporarily. This miscalculation mirrors, structurally, the opening heist's logic of betrayal. Just as the bank robbers believed they were rational actors in a scheme with a comprehensible payoff structure, the mob bosses believe they are engaging a rational actor whose price and incentives can be understood and controlled. In both cases, the Joker exploits this assumption of rationality to devastating effect. The mob's fortune, laundered and hidden through Lau, becomes both a plot engine, driving Batman's journey to Hong Kong to extract Lau, and a symbolic object, money that ultimately means nothing to the film's antagonist except as fuel, literally, for a demonstration of how little material wealth matters when set against ideological commitment. Hong Kong, extraction, and the limits of legitimate method. Batman's extraction of Lau from Hong Kong, accomplished with critical technological assistance from Lucius Fox, represents one of the film's clearest illustrations of Batman operating at the outer edge of acceptable method while still remaining, in the film's moral accounting, within some recognizable ethical boundary. The sequence is characteristically spectacular, but its narrative function is comparatively modest. It exists to remove Lau's advantage of extraterritorial safety and deliver him into a jurisdiction where his testimony can be used against the crime families he served. That Dent is able to leverage this testimony to indict virtually the entire criminal establishment in one sweeping legal action demonstrates, momentarily, the promise of the alliance functioning as designed, legitimate prosecutorial power amplified by vigilante capability delivering a result that neither could achieve alone. The triumph is short-lived and, crucially, the film uses it as the precise trigger for the Joker's campaign of assassination. Rather than treating the mass indictment as an ending, the narrative treats it as an escalation point. The mob's desperation following this legal defeat is what drives them to formally accept the Joker's offer, setting in motion the killing of the judge and Commissioner Lub, and the broader campaign of violence targeting anyone associated with challenging the criminal establishment. This sequencing is important thematically because it demonstrates that Dent and Gordon's institutional victory does not resolve the film's central conflict, it accelerates it. Institutional success against traditional organized crime turns out to be precisely what invites a more dangerous, ideologically motivated form of violence to fill the vacuum. The fundraiser, the window, and the first direct assault. The Joker's appearance at Bruce Wayne's fundraising event for Harvey Dent operates as the film's first direct, personal confrontation between the Joker and the people Batman cares about, rather than an abstract institutional target. Throwing Rachel from a window is simultaneously an assassination attempt, a psychological test of Batman's priorities, and pure theater designed for maximum audience terror among Gotham's elite guests. Batman's rescue of Rachel, executed with his characteristic mixture of physical capability and technological improvisation, momentarily reassures the audience that Batman's vigilance can outpace the Joker's violence. But this rescue is itself a kind of trap the film sets for the viewer, encouraging a confidence in Batman's protective capacity that will be catastrophically undercut later at the film's midpoint, when an almost identical rescue scenario, racing to save someone he loves from an explosive device, ends in failure rather than success. Alfred's now famous observation, offered when Bruce struggles to comprehend what the Joker actually wants, functions as the film's most explicit thematic signpost. Some people cannot be reasoned with, bought off, or deterred through conventional threat assessment because their objective is not power, territory, or survival, but the demonstration that everyone else's order is illusory. This single line reframes the entire conflict for the audience, moving the story's central question away from, how do we stop this criminal, toward, how do we resist an argument about human nature, which is a far more unsettling problem for both the characters and the audience to sit with. Dent's public gambit and the interrogation. Harvey Dent's decision to publicly claim he is Batman, intended to draw the Joker into the open and end the crisis of anonymous violence terrorizing Gotham, reveals Dent's willingness to sacrifice his own safety and reputation for what he perceives as the greater good, a willingness that makes his eventual corruption more tragic precisely because it confirms he was, at this point, still operating from genuine civic idealism rather than self-interest. The subsequent attack on the police convoy transporting Dent, followed by Batman and Gordon's successful apprehension of the Joker, creates the film's false dawn, a moment where institutional cooperation between vigilante and police force appears to have decisively won. The interrogation scene that follows is arguably the film's ideological centerpiece, a sustained two-character confrontation in which the Joker, entirely unconcerned by his captivity, systematically dismantles Batman's assumption that capturing him represents victory. The Joker's confession that he has no genuine desire to kill Batman, that he finds their conflict a source of amusement rather than animosity, reframes the entire pursuit. He was never trying to escape or defeat Batman in any conventional sense, because his actual objective operates on a different plane entirely. He is not interested in winning a physical confrontation, he is interested in proving a philosophical point about the fragility of the codes people like Batman, Dent, and Gordon believe they live by. The revelation that Rachel and Dent are both being held in separate, rigged locations, and Batman's frantic choice to save Rachel while Gordon's team races toward Dent, sets up the film's most devastating structural twist. The switched addresses and the cost of the rescue. The Joker's decision to give Batman and Gordon's team reverse locations for Rachel and Dent is perhaps the single cruelest and most narratively consequential act of manipulation in the film, because it does not merely cause a tragedy, it inverts the outcome the audience has been trained to expect based on the earlier fundraiser rescue. Batman races toward what he believes is Rachel's location only to discover, in the film's most quietly devastating reveal, that he has instead reached Dent, while Gordon's team, dispatched to what they believed was Dent's location, arrives too late to save Rachel from the explosion that kills her and disfigures half of Dent's face. This sequence achieves several things simultaneously. Dramatically, it removes Rachel entirely from the narrative, closing off the romantic possibility that had motivated Bruce's hope of eventual retirement from vigilantism, and it does so with a bleakness the film refuses to soften. There is no rescue, no last-second reprieve, only failure disguised as effort. Thematically, it delivers the Joker's central argument in the most brutal terms possible, that even the most careful planning and the most sincere effort can be rendered meaningless by a sufficiently intelligent adversary who understands exactly which assumptions to exploit. And structurally, it converts Harvey Dent from Gotham's incorruptible champion into a physically and psychologically shattered figure whose subsequent transformation into Two-Face becomes not an arbitrary villain origin beat but the direct, causally coherent result of the specific traumas the narrative has carefully constructed. The Reese crisis and the hospital gambit. The subplot involving Coleman Reese, the Wayne Enterprises employee who deduces Batman's identity and threatens to expose it publicly, might initially seem like a digression from the film's central conflict, but it functions as another controlled experiment in the Joker's ongoing project of testing civic solidarity under pressure. The Joker's threat to destroy a hospital unless Reese is killed forces the city into a moral bind that mirrors, in a smaller and more localized way, the fairy dilemma that will follow. Ordinary citizens are asked to weigh one life against collective safety, and the resulting chaos, evacuations, panic, Gordon's desperate effort to protect Reese while maintaining order, demonstrates how quickly civic infrastructure can be destabilized by a single, well-placed threat. It is during this period of maximum civic disorder that the Joker locates the psychologically shattered Dent in the hospital and delivers what amounts to the film's most important villain monologue, an extended argument in favor of chaos as a fairer, more honest organizing principle than the arbitrary systems of planning and control that supposedly govern civilized life. The Joker frames Rachel's death, and by extension all of Dent's suffering, as simply the result of the plan failing, in contrast to his own method, which embraces randomness as a kind of moral leveler, something no one can blame or resent because it does not discriminate. This argument succeeds precisely because Dent has just experienced firsthand the failure of careful planning to protect the people he loved, making him uniquely vulnerable to an ideology that promises to make sense of senseless loss by declaring that sense was never really possible in the first place. Dent's subsequent adoption of the scarred, two-headed coin as his new method of judgment, killing the officers and mob figures he holds responsible for Rachel's death, marks the completion of his transformation from idealistic prosecutor into an agent of the same chaotic logic the Joker has been arguing for throughout the film, even though Dent frames his own version as a form of justice rather than nihilism. The ferry sequence represents the culmination of the Joker's entire campaign, the largest-scale version of the moral experiment he has been running throughout the film in progressively intensifying forms. Two evacuation ferries, one carrying civilian passengers and the other carrying prisoners, are each given the detonator for the other boat's explosives, with the Joker's ultimatum being that if neither group destroys the other by midnight, he will destroy both. This scenario is engineered to produce exactly the kind of betrayal the opening bank heist demonstrated in miniature. Ordinary people, placed under existential pressure and given the tools to save themselves at another group's expense, expected to reveal that self-preservation ultimately overrides any pretense of collective morality. The refusal of both boats' passengers to use the detonators, including the prisoners' boat's decision to have their moral responsibility for the choice taken out of their hands by their circumstances, represents the film's single clearest rebuttal to the Joker's worldview. It is a moment of genuine, if fragile, faith in ordinary human decency winning out even under maximum psychological pressure, and its placement immediately before Batman's final confrontation with the Joker gives the resolution of that particular thread real weight. The citizens of Gotham succeed where the Joker predicted they would fail, even as Harvey Dent, supposedly their most virtuous representative, has already failed in exactly the way the Joker predicted. Batman's restraint and the Joker's final claim. Batman's decision not to kill the Joker after subduing him reaffirms the specific ethical boundary that has defined the character since Batman Begins, a refusal to become the kind of unrestrained instrument of violence that would validate the Joker's argument that everyone, given sufficient provocation, will abandon their principles. Yet the Joker's parting words, acknowledging that Batman has proven incorruptible while claiming victory in his separate project of corrupting Dent, reveal the actual scope of his ambitions. He was never trying to break Batman specifically. Batman was, if anything, a secondary target whose incorruptibility served as a control condition against which Dent's corruption could be measured and demonstrated. The real experiment was always about proving that even Gotham's most legitimate, most publicly beloved symbol of hope could be broken, and in that specific, narrower objective, the Joker succeeds completely. Dent's fall and Batman's final sacrifice. The film's climax, in which a fully transformed Dent takes Gordon's family hostage and subjects their fates to the same coin-flip logic that has governed his recent killings, closes the loop on his arc with brutal symmetry. The man who once represented Gotham's faith in due process and legitimate justice now determines life and death through pure chance, the philosophical opposite of everything he formerly stood for. Batman's intervention, tackling Dent to save Gordon's son and causing Dent's fatal fall, resolves the immediate threat but creates the film's final, most morally complex dilemma: what to do with the knowledge that Gotham's beloved White Knight has become a killer. Batman's choice to take responsibility for Dent's crimes, convincing Gordon to conceal the truth and preserve Dent's public image as a martyred hero, represents the film's most explicit statement about the relationship between truth and social stability. It is a decision built on the premise that Gotham's citizens need a symbol of incorruptible justice to believe in, even if that symbol must be sustained through a deliberate lie, and that Batman, already operating outside the boundaries of legitimate authority, is uniquely positioned to absorb the cost of that lie without further damaging the institutions Dent's exposure would otherwise destroy. The quiet destruction of Rachel's undelivered letter revealing her choice of Dent over Bruce, and Lucius Fox's insistence on dismantling the surveillance apparatus that had briefly given Batman near-omniscient capability, function as closing gestures that reinforce the film's broader ambivalence about power. Even necessary or well-intentioned instruments of control and deception must be relinquished once their immediate purpose has passed, lest they become permanent fixtures of a compromised system. The film ends not with triumph but with Batman fleeing as a hunted man, having sacrificed his reputation to preserve a myth, leaving the audience with a resolution that is simultaneously an act of profound heroism and a quietly devastating admission that the city's peace has been purchased through concealment rather than genuine justice. The cast of The Dark Knight is unusually purposeful in how it distributes narrative and thematic weight. Rather than assembling a roster of recognizable faces to populate a familiar comic book plot, Christopher Nolan structured his ensemble so that nearly every character, however minor, contributes to the film's central inquiry into how institutions and individuals behave under existential pressure. The principal cast forms a kind of moral spectrum, with each character occupying a distinct position between order and chaos, legitimacy and vigilantism, idealism and corruption. Understanding the film's achievement requires looking closely at how each performer and role was calibrated to serve that larger design. Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne, grief as origin, duty as cage. Christian Bale's portrayal of Bruce Wayne carries forward the psychological groundwork laid in Batman Begins, in which the character's parents' murder during his childhood becomes the traumatic wound from which his entire adult identity grows. By the time of The Dark Knight, Bruce has already processed this trauma into a mission, but the film is less interested in relitigating his original wound than in examining what sustained vigilantism costs a person who has already made peace with why he does it. Bale plays Bruce as a man increasingly divided between two identities that were never meant to coexist indefinitely: the socialite playboy persona he maintains as camouflage, and the increasingly exhausted, morally strained figure underneath the cowl. What makes Bale's performance essential to the film's larger argument is the way it registers doubt without ever registering weakness. Bruce Wayne in this film believes, with real conviction, that his role as Batman should be temporary, a stopgap measure until Gotham produces legitimate heroes like Harvey Dent who can inherit the responsibility of protecting the city through lawful means. This belief drives much of his personal arc, particularly his support for Dent's political rise and his hope that Dent's ascension might finally allow him to retire from vigilantism and pursue a life with Rachel Dawes. The tragedy embedded in Bale's performance is that Bruce's hope for an exit is never realistic, and the audience senses this long before Bruce is forced to accept it. His private conversations with Alfred carry an undertone of a man trying to convince himself of a future he does not entirely believe is available to him. By the film's end, Bale's Bruce is asked to accept an even heavier burden than continued vigilantism, the acceptance of public villainy in Dent's place, a sacrifice that requires him to become, at least temporarily, the very thing Gotham has been hunting. Michael Caine's Alfred, conscience disguised as service. Michael Caine's Alfred Pennyworth occupies a role in the film that exceeds the traditional function of a butler character in adaptations of this material. Alfred is positioned as Bruce's only remaining connection to ordinary domestic life and, more importantly, as the film's moral conscience, a voice of accumulated wisdom that Bruce trusts precisely because Alfred has no stake in Bruce's mission beyond his devotion to Bruce's well-being. Kane's performance emphasizes warmth without sentimentality, his affection for Bruce is evident, but it never curdles into indulgence, and Alfred is willing to challenge Bruce's choices directly when he believes Bruce is deceiving himself. Alfred's most significant contribution to the film's thematic architecture comes in his response to Bruce's confusion about the Joker's motives. When Bruce, accustomed to fighting criminals whose goals of profit or power are at least comprehensible, struggles to understand an adversary who seems to want nothing tangible, Alfred offers the observation that some men have no interest in the logical, self-interested behavior most criminals display, and instead simply want to see the existing order collapse. This single exchange reframes the entire conflict of the film for the audience, shifting the terms of engagement from a conventional battle of wits to something closer to an ideological siege. Alfred's function throughout the film is to occasionally step outside the immediate tactical questions Bruce is preoccupied with and name the larger stakes plainly, grounding the story's philosophical ambitions in a character whose primary loyalty is not to any abstract cause but to a person he has effectively raised as his own. Later in the film, Alfred's decision to burn Rachel's undelivered letter, in which she reveals her choice to remain with Harvey Dent rather than wait for Bruce, represents one of the more quietly devastating character choices in the film. Alfred's judgment that Bruce is better served by continued hope than by a painful truth reveals the complexity of his role. He is not simply a passive servant reporting information but an active participant in managing what Bruce is permitted to know, a small-scale echo of the larger deceptions the film's climax will require Batman and Gordon to sustain for the good of the city. Heath Ledger's Joker, villainy without a ledger. Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker anchors the film's entire ideological project, and its impact is difficult to overstate both in terms of the character's function within the story and its cultural resonance beyond it. Ledger's Joker is deliberately constructed to resist the audience's usual tools for understanding a villain. He offers multiple, contradictory accounts of how he acquired his facial scars, he has no discernible criminal organization or hierarchy of his own, and he displays no interest in the wealth or territory that motivates every other criminal figure in the film. This absence of a stable backstory is not a narrative oversight but a deliberate thematic choice, designed to prevent the audience from psychologizing him into a comprehensible, containable figure. He functions less as a character with motives in the traditional sense and more as an embodiment of an argument, that the codes of conduct people rely on to trust one another and their institutions are more fragile and more arbitrary than they would like to believe, and that sufficient pressure will expose this fragility in almost anyone. Ledger's physical and vocal choices reinforce this thematic function at every level. His unpredictable rhythm of speech, his compulsive licking of his lips, his loose and unstable posture, all combine to produce a performance that feels genuinely unmoored rather than merely eccentric. Where earlier screen interpretations of the character leaned into a theatrical, almost vaudevillian energy, Ledger's interpretation is closer to something feral and improvisational, a quality that makes his scenes feel dangerous in a way that keeps the audience perpetually uncertain of what he might do next. This unpredictability becomes the character's most effective weapon, because neither the film's characters nor its audience can reliably anticipate the Joker's next move. Every scene he appears in carries a charge of genuine tension rather than the comfortable dread of a familiar villain executing an expected plan. The tragic circumstances surrounding Ledger's death in January 2008, several months before the film's release, inevitably reshaped how audiences approached and processed the performance. What might have been an unusually acclaimed supporting turn in an ordinary release cycle became, instead, a performance viewed through the lens of finality, the last complete work from an actor who would not have the opportunity to build on what he had accomplished. The posthumous recognition the performance received across major awards bodies marked a significant moment for the genre, effectively establishing that a comic book villain performance could be judged by the same critical standards typically reserved for dramatic character work, a precedent that has influenced how such performances are evaluated ever since. Gary Oldman's Gordon, integrity without spectacle. Gary Oldman's Commissioner Gordon, still a lieutenant for much of the film, provides the story's most consistent embodiment of institutional integrity, functioning as proof that legitimate law enforcement can remain honest even within a police department otherwise riddled with corruption. Oldman plays Gordon with a deliberate lack of theatrical flourish, a choice that suits the character's function as the film's grounded, procedural counterweight to the more operatic figures of Batman, the Joker, and eventually Dent. Gordon's heroism in the film is defined not by physical confrontation but by persistence, competence, and a willingness to make difficult tactical decisions under pressure, whether that means faking his own death to protect his family or maintaining Batman's trust despite the political risk of associating with a vigilante. Gordon's family, glimpsed at various points throughout the film, serves an important narrative purpose beyond simple characterization. They represent the ordinary domestic stakes that Gordon is trying to protect through his professional integrity, and their presence in the film's climax, when Dent takes them hostage in his final descent into vengeful violence, gives that confrontation a personal urgency that elevates it beyond an abstract battle between heroism and villainy. Gordon's eventual promotion to commissioner by the film's end, earned through his competence and endurance rather than any singular heroic act, reinforces the film's broader argument that meaningful institutional change often comes through unglamorous persistence rather than dramatic intervention. Aaron Eckhart's Harvey Dent, The Tragedy of Broken Idealism. Aaron Eckhart's performance as Harvey Dent may be the most structurally demanding in the film, because it requires him to be entirely convincing as two seemingly incompatible figures, first as Gotham's inspiring, principled district attorney, genuinely committed to reforming the city's justice system through legitimate means, and later as Two-Face, a disfigured avenger who has abandoned every principle he once held in favor of a nihilistic reliance on random chance. For the transformation to carry emotional weight rather than feeling like an arbitrary plot mechanism, Eckhart's early scenes must establish Dent as someone genuinely worth admiring and, crucially, worth mourning once his fall occurs. Dent's characterization throughout the film's first half emphasizes his willingness to take personal risks for the sake of justice, his charisma as a public figure capable of inspiring confidence in Gotham citizens, and his romantic relationship with Rachel Dawes, which positions him as Bruce Wayne's unwitting rival even as Bruce publicly champions Dent's career. The specific mechanism of Dent's fall, disfigurement and the loss of Rachel occurring simultaneously, engineered by the Joker's deliberate manipulation of information given to Batman and Gordon, ensures that his transformation reads as a direct consequence of trauma rather than a revelation of hidden villainy that was there all along. Eckhart's physical performance after the transformation, including his altered vocal delivery and posture on the scarred side of his face, sells this shift as a genuine psychological break rather than a costume change, and his eventual death at the film's climax, brought about by Batman's intervention to save Gordon's son, completes an arc that stands as one of the more sophisticated tragic character studies in mainstream action cinema. Maggie Gyllenhaal's Rachel Dawes, The Stakes Made Personal. Maggie Gyllenhaal's Rachel Dawes, an assistant district attorney and Bruce Wayne's childhood friend, occupies a role whose narrative function extends well beyond typical romantic interest positioning. Rachel's divided feelings between Bruce and Harvey give the film's central emotional triangle real stakes, since her choice between them is not a matter of vague sentiment but reflects a genuine judgment about which man represents a more viable, sustainable partner, Harvey, who can offer her a legitimate public life, or Bruce, whose secret identity and consuming mission make any future with him inherently unstable and dangerous. Rachel's death at the film's midpoint, engineered through the Joker's manipulation of Batman's rescue priorities, removes this romantic possibility from the narrative entirely and does so with a bluntness that refuses the audience any comforting last-minute reversal. Her death functions as the hinge on which the rest of the film's plot turns, precipitating both Dent's transformation into Two-Face and the psychological burden Bruce carries for the remainder of the story. The subsequent revelation, through her undelivered letter, that she had already chosen Dent before her death adds a final layer of tragic irony to Bruce's loss. He is left grieving not only her death but the confirmation that even had she lived, the future he hoped for was never going to materialize. Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox, The Ethical Limit on Power. Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox, Wayne Enterprises' chief executive, provides Batman with both the technological resources necessary for his campaign and a crucial ethical check on how those resources are used. Fox's role in supplying and maintaining Batman's equipment situates him as an essential but discreet partner in Batman's operation, someone whose competence allows the film's more spectacular sequences, from armored vehicles to specialized surveillance technology, to feel grounded in a plausible chain of production and maintenance rather than appearing as unexplained magic. Fox's most significant contribution to the film's thematic concerns arises from his discomfort with the citywide surveillance system Batman requests to track the Joker through Gotham's cell phone network. Freeman plays this discomfort with quiet conviction rather than dramatic confrontation, making clear that Fox's cooperation is conditional and reluctant rather than enthusiastic. His insistence that the system be destroyed once it has served its immediate purpose, and his willingness to resign rather than operate it himself, establishes an important counterweight to Batman's willingness to employ ethically questionable methods in pursuit of urgent goals. Fox functions, in effect, as the film's conscience regarding the dangers of unchecked power, even power wielded by someone the audience trusts. Beyond its central figures, the film's supporting cast populates a detailed portrait of Gotham's criminal and civic institutions under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The established crime bosses, representing the old guard mafia structure that has long controlled Gotham's underworld, are portrayed as increasingly outmatched by the modern threats of aggressive prosecution and the Joker's chaotic methods, their attempt to hire the Joker as a solution to their problems ultimately accelerating their own destruction. The banker who launders and conceals the mob's fortune before attempting to flee prosecution becomes a crucial plot engine, his testimony enabling Dent's sweeping indictment of the criminal establishment and his subsequent fate at the Joker's hands demonstrating the price of becoming entangled with an ally who has no interest in honoring transactional loyalty. Within the police department, the supporting cast illustrates the uneven, compromised state of Gotham's law enforcement, a corrupt commissioner whose assassination exposes the vulnerability of even high-ranking officials, detectives with divided loyalties whose corruption Gordon must navigate carefully, and a rookie officer whose susceptibility to bribery becomes a critical vulnerability that the Joker exploits with devastating effect. This detailed rendering of institutional weakness reinforces the film's broader argument that Gotham's civic infrastructure, for all its aspirations toward legitimacy, remains riddled with exploitable gaps. Additional figures round out the film's portrait of a city under duress: a Wayne Enterprises employee whose attempt to expose Batman's identity for personal gain nearly triggers a citywide catastrophe, a television reporter whose broadcasts shape public perception of the unfolding crisis, a mayor whose survival amid the Joker's assassination campaign underscores the precariousness of civic leadership, and a disturbed henchman whose willingness to participate in the Joker's scheme speaks to the kind of unstable, marginalized figures drawn into his orbit. Cameo appearances, including a reprised role from the previous film's antagonist now confined to Arkham Asylum, along with brief appearances from a musician and a real-world political figure known for his enthusiasm for the character, add texture to the film's world without disrupting its narrative momentum. Even Gordon's family, his wife and 2 children, serve a clear purpose beyond incidental detail, grounding his professional integrity in tangible domestic stakes that become directly threatened in the film's climax. An ensemble in service of an argument. What emerges from this survey of the film's cast is a portrait of an ensemble constructed with unusual discipline. Virtually every role, however brief, contributes to the film's sustained interrogation of how individuals and institutions respond when tested by chaos, temptation, or fear. The central performances carry the philosophical weight of the story's argument about corruption and idealism, while the supporting cast populates a detailed, internally consistent civic ecosystem whose various weaknesses and strengths are precisely what allow the Joker's experiments to unfold with such devastating clarity. Few films in the superhero genre have assembled a cast so thoroughly calibrated to serve a coherent thematic purpose, and this precision remains a significant part of why The Dark Knight continues to be studied as a high-water mark for the genre's dramatic ambitions. It is easy, in retrospect, to treat The Dark Knight as the inevitable second chapter of a trilogy Christopher Nolan had mapped out from the beginning. The reality of its origins is considerably messier and more instructive. When Batman Begins was released in 2005, Nolan himself was not confident the film would perform well enough commercially to justify a follow-up, and he had no clear intention of making a sequel at all. This uncertainty is worth dwelling on, because it complicates the common narrative of Nolan as a director who arrived with a fully formed trilogy in mind. Instead, the studio's enthusiasm arrived first, driven by the film's critical and financial success, and Nolan's own creative interest in continuing the story developed only gradually and with considerable hesitation. The famous final image of Batman Begins, in which Lieutenant Gordon presents Batman with a Joker playing card left behind at a crime scene, has often been read by audiences as a calculated tease for a sequel, an early promise that the series' most iconic villain was waiting in the wings. In fact, this moment functioned less as pure marketing setup and more as a thematic seed. It existed to plant the idea that Batman's optimistic assumption, that his war on crime could be a temporary, containable project, was itself a kind of fallacy, doomed to be undermined by the very success of his efforts. Nolan and his collaborators were, even at that early stage, already interested in the idea that extraordinary vigilante action might not simply suppress crime but provoke a new, more dangerous category of adversary. The playing card was less an advertisement than a piece of dramatic irony planted for a future the filmmakers weren't yet sure they would get to explore. Nolan's working relationship with his producing partner and wife Emma Thomas had, up to this point, never involved a sequel, which meant the entire project required the pair to think through creative and structural challenges neither had faced before in their careers. Rather than resolving these questions quickly, Nolan discussed possibilities with his Batman Begins co-writer David Goyer throughout the production of that earlier film, a process that produced early outlines for what could become not just one but potentially two further installments. Nolan's hesitation was not simply a matter of confidence in the underlying material, it reflected a genuine difficulty in figuring out how to extend the specific tone and internal logic Batman Begins had established without either repeating its structure or abandoning what had made it distinctive. What ultimately tipped Nolan toward pursuing the sequel was less a resolved outline than a growing interest in a specific creative opportunity, using the Joker within the same grounded, psychologically plausible register that had defined Batman Begins, rather than treating the character as an excuse to shift the series toward a more fantastical or theatrical tone. Formal discussions between Nolan and Warner Brothers about the sequel began not long after Batman Begins reached theaters, but meaningful development did not begin in earnest until after Nolan had completed work on The Prestige, the intervening film that occupied his attention through 2006. This gap matters. It demonstrates that The Dark Knight was not rushed into production to capitalize immediately on its predecessor's success, but was allowed to incubate alongside an entirely separate project, giving Nolan space to return to Gotham with fresh creative energy rather than under pressure to immediately replicate a formula. Escalation as the organizing idea. Once development began in earnest, Nolan and Goyer spent an extended period, roughly 3 months, working through the core narrative architecture that would eventually become the finished film. The concept they settled on as their organizing principle was escalation, the idea that Batman's extraordinary methods, however well-intentioned, would not simply suppress ordinary criminality but would provoke a corresponding escalation among Gotham's criminal element, eventually summoning a figure whose methods matched Batman's own extremity but whose goals were entirely different. This concept gave the Joker character his narrative justification within the story's internal logic. He is not simply an already existing villain who happens to appear, but a kind of natural consequence of Batman's presence, an adversary whose emergence the previous film had already, if unknowingly, set into motion. This idea of escalation also clarified what kind of villain the Joker needed to be. Rather than a criminal seeking profit, territory, or conventional power, he needed to represent an entirely different category of threat, one built around terrorism as a method, using fear and destabilization rather than material gain as his primary currency. This framing gave the writers a clear thematic through-line that would eventually shape virtually every major set piece in the finished film, from the bank heist to the ferry dilemma, each one constructed as an experiment in provoking fear and testing the limits of civic solidarity rather than a conventional criminal scheme. Resisting the impulse toward direct allegory. Given the film's release in the years following the September 11th attacks and during the ongoing debates over the War on Terror, it would have been easy for Nolan and Goyer to construct their story as a direct political allegory, mapping specific real-world policies or events onto the plot in recognizable ways. They deliberately avoided this approach. Rather than including intentional parallels to specific counterterrorism laws, government surveillance programs, or particular geopolitical events, the writers chose to let their story's resonance with contemporary anxieties emerge organically from its underlying themes rather than through direct correspondence to real institutions or policies. Their reasoning centered on a belief that overt political commentary would compromise the story's dramatic integrity, turning what they wanted to be a timeless exploration of chaos, fear, and moral compromise into something more narrowly topical and, potentially, more quickly dated. This choice reflects a broader philosophy about how genre fiction can engage with real anxieties without becoming a thinly veiled political statement. By keeping the story's engagement with terrorism, surveillance, and civic fear at the level of theme rather than direct allegory, Nolan and Goyer created a film that could resonate with audiences experiencing genuine unease about security, trust, and institutional overreach without requiring viewers to map specific real-world figures or policies onto the narrative. Nolan's own description of the film as an expression of his personal fear of anarchy, and his characterization of the Joker as a figure whose primary desire is simply to dismantle the existing order around him, suggests that the emotional core of the story was rooted in something more universal and personally felt than a response to any particular news cycle. Constructing a Joker without an origin. One of the more consequential creative decisions made during development concerned how to handle the Joker's backstory, or more precisely, the decision not to give him one. Goya had long admired the character's appearance in Tim Burton's 1989 Batman film, featuring Jack Nicholson, but did not find that earlier interpretation genuinely frightening, viewing it as too theatrical and too tethered to a comprehensible origin story to generate real dread. For their version, Goya wanted a villain who felt fundamentally unknowable, someone whose menace derived precisely from the audience's inability to trace his violence back to a clear psychological cause. He drew a comparison to the shark in Jaws, a monster whose terror is amplified rather than diminished by its opacity, its lack of comprehensible motive beyond its essential nature. Nolan and Goya extended this philosophy into a broader argument about villain characterization generally, one grounded in the idea that giving audiences too much insight into a villain's origins tends to diminish rather than enhance their menace over successive appearances. They pointed to other iconic screen villains, such as Hannibal Lecter and Darth Vader, whose earlier appearances had traded on mystery and implication, only to have subsequent films or prequels attempt to explain their formation in ways that, in the writer's assessment, made them less unsettling rather than more compelling. Applying this principle to their own villain, Nolan and Goya made the explicit choice to withhold any stable, verifiable account of how the Joker acquired his scars or became who he is, instead allowing the character to offer multiple, contradictory explanations throughout the film, each delivered with equal conviction and each designed to leave the audience without a reliable account to hold on to. Once the foundational concepts were in place, the task of turning them into an actual screenplay fell substantially to Christopher's brother, Jonathan Nolan, who spent an extended period, roughly 6 months, developing the story into a full draft. This draft was then submitted to Warner Brothers for feedback, after which Jonathan continued refining the material for a further 2 months while Christopher remained occupied directing The Prestige. Only once that earlier project was complete could the brothers turn their full collaborative attention to finalizing the script, a process that extended across roughly 6 additional months running concurrently with the film's pre-production. This lengthy, staggered writing process, spanning more than a year in total and interrupted by an entirely separate production, suggests a level of patience and iterative refinement that is somewhat unusual for a major studio tentpole operating on a fixed release timeline. It also underscores the collaborative nature of the Nolan brothers' creative partnership, with Jonathan taking primary responsibility for the initial dramatic architecture and dialogue while Christopher's directorial sensibility, informed by his experience shooting Batman Begins and his ongoing thematic interests, shaped the final version during their joint work in pre-production. Jonathan Nolan has identified the film's ending as the aspect of the script he found most compelling, describing it as poignant in a way that distinguished it from a conventional superhero conclusion. From very early in the writing process, the ending was conceived around the image of Batman fleeing from the police, a choice that reframes the film's hero, in its final moments, as a fugitive rather than a triumphant figure. The specific mechanics of that fleeing sequence evolved during development. An early version imagined Batman making his escape by leaping across rooftops, a more traditionally acrobatic and visually familiar image for the character, but this was ultimately revised so that Batman instead escapes on the Batpod, his motorcycle-styled vehicle, weaving through the city streets rather than moving above them. This shift arguably reinforces the film's grounded aesthetic, keeping its hero's final image tethered to street-level urban reality rather than a more fantastical, elevated escape. Jonathan has also singled out a specific piece of dialogue as the line he considered most important to the entire script, the observation that a person either dies a hero or lives long enough to see themselves become the villain. According to his account, this line arrived relatively late in the writing process, which is notable given how thoroughly it now functions as a thematic summary of the film's treatment of Harvey Dent's arc, encapsulating in a single sentence the tragic trajectory from idealistic prosecutor to vengeful, disfigured avenger. That such a central thematic statement emerged late in development, rather than serving as an original guiding principle from which the rest of the story was built, illustrates how the writing process allowed the film's themes to sharpen and crystallize gradually rather than being fully articulated from the outset. Cinematic influences, crime drama over comic book convention. In shaping the tone and structure of their screenplay, the Nolans drew heavily on influences from outside the superhero genre entirely, citing films such as The Godfather and Heath as touchstones for the kind of story they wanted to tell. Both of these reference points are, notably, crime dramas concerned with the internal mechanics of criminal organizations, law enforcement, and the moral compromises required to operate within or against those systems, rather than films built around spectacle for its own sake. This influence is evident throughout The Dark Knight's finished structure, particularly in its sustained attention to the mechanics of organized crime, money laundering, prosecutorial strategy, and police procedure, elements that occupy substantial screen time and give the film's larger set pieces a sense of grounded consequence rather than arbitrary spectacle. By maintaining the tone Batman Begins had already established while deepening this crime drama sensibility, the finished script arrived at something that reads, structurally and tonally, closer to an ensemble crime picture than a conventional superhero narrative, even though its central characters include a costumed vigilante and a comic book-derived villain. This blending of genre registers is part of what allowed the film to be taken seriously by audiences and critics who might otherwise have approached a superhero sequel with lower expectations for dramatic sophistication. Comic book roots: Miller, Loeb, and Sale. Although the finished screenplay drew significant inspiration from crime cinema, its comic book foundations remained important to its development. The Nolans found particular value in the work of writer Frank Miller's influential comics from the 1980s, which had reimagined Batman and his world in a more serious, psychologically grounded register than earlier eras of the character's publication history. Equally significant was the limited comic book series that explored the interconnected relationship between Batman, Harvey Dent, and Jim Gordon across the span of a single year, a work whose thematic interest in the parallel moral trajectories of these three men directly informed the film's decision to position all three characters as intertwined figures whose fates are bound together by their shared campaign against organized crime. This influence is most visible in the film's treatment of Harvey Dent, who was conceived from the earliest stages of the writing process as the story's true central character, more so even than Batman himself. The Nolans structured the narrative around a battle being waged over Dent's soul. Batman, believing Dent represents the legitimate, lawful hero Gotham actually needs, invests his hope and public support in Dent's rise, while the Joker, pursuing his broader thesis about the fragility of virtue under pressure, specifically targets Dent as the test case that will prove even the most righteous, most publicly beloved figures can be broken. Christopher Nolan has explicitly noted that the film's title refers as much to Dent's own descent into darkness as it does to Batman's more familiar nocturnal heroics, and he found Dent's inherent duality, a legitimate public hero harboring the potential for a much darker second self, dramatically comparable to the duality already built into Batman's own identity as Bruce Wayne. An important structural consequence of centering Dent's arc so thoroughly was the writer's decision to keep Bruce Wayne and his Batman persona relatively static throughout the film, a character who does not undergo the kind of dramatic internal transformation that defines Dent's journey. This was a deliberate choice rather than an oversight, because Batman Begins had already completed Bruce's foundational arc of accepting his mission and establishing his methods. The Dark Knight did not need to put him through another comparable transformation. Instead, Bruce serves largely as a fixed moral anchor against which the more volatile transformations of Dent and, in a different register, the Joker's various manipulations can be measured. This relative stasis allowed the film to use its central hero as a stable point of reference for the audience while directing its most dramatic character development toward Dent, whose fall carries greater tragic weight precisely because it represents genuine change rather than the reinforcement of an already established identity. Writing the Joker is born of clarity. Despite the philosophical complexity embedded in the character, Christopher Nolan has described the process of writing the Joker as the easiest part of the overall script, a claim that becomes more understandable once the underlying approach is considered. Rather than building the character from an elaborate personal history or a carefully plotted arc, the Nolans instead worked by identifying a set of traits and behaviors common across the Joker's various media appearances over the decades, distilling these into a coherent set of core characteristics that could then be deployed consistently without needing to be justified by a specific backstory. This approach was further shaped by influences beyond the comics themselves, including the sinister mastermind Dr. Mabuse from the films of director Fritz Lang, a character whose combination of criminal genius and almost supernatural unpredictability offered a useful cinematic template for a villain operating outside conventional criminal motivation. A particularly significant influence, despite not directly shaping the narrative's specific plot events, came from Alan Moore's graphic novel exploring a possible origin for the character, in which the Joker's worldview partly stems from a desire to prove that anyone, subjected to a sufficiently bad day, could be broken down into someone resembling himself. Christopher Nolan credited this thematic idea, rather than any specific narrative details from that source, with helping the writers locate a coherent underlying purpose for a character who might otherwise have remained frustratingly without direction. By giving the Joker's chaos a specific philosophical target, namely the idea that even the most virtuous people carry within them the same capacity for collapse under pressure, the writers transformed what could have been an aimless embodiment of anarchy into an antagonist whose actions consistently serve a legible, if disturbing, thesis. The Joker as written became a figure defined by an absence of conventional reason, logic, or fear, whose entire function within the story is to test the moral and ethical boundaries of Batman, Dent, and Gordon, each in a different way suited to that character's particular position within Gotham's civic order. In an amusing footnote to this careful construction process, Christopher and Jonathan Nolan later realized that the version of the character they had built from these varied influences bore a strong resemblance to the Joker's very first appearance in the character's original comic book debut in 1940, an unplanned convergence that suggests their instinctive approach to distilling the character's essential qualities led them back toward something close to his most foundational depiction, stripped of decades of subsequent reinterpretation. An ending without a sequel in mind. The film's final exchange between Batman and the captured Joker, in which the Joker predicts that the two of them are locked into an endless cycle of conflict because neither will ultimately kill the other, has often been interpreted by audiences as a deliberate setup for future installments featuring the character's return. According to the writer's own account, this was not the intention behind the line. Rather than functioning as a sequel tease, the exchange was meant to articulate something more thematically final, an acknowledgement that Batman and the Joker represent diametrically opposed philosophies locked in permanent tension precisely because Batman's ethical code forbids him from ending the conflict through lethal force, while the Joker's entire worldview depends on that ongoing tension continuing indefinitely rather than being resolved. The line closes the film not with a promise of narrative continuation but with a statement about the fundamentally irresolvable nature of the ideological conflict at its center, a conflict that the rest of the trilogy would go on to address primarily through Bruce Wayne's own personal journey rather than through any direct continuation of the Joker's story. Christian Bale's own account of how Bruce Wayne evolved between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight offers a useful entry point into understanding the film's larger emotional register. In the earlier film, Bale conceived of Bruce as a young man defined primarily by anger and an unfocused hunger for purpose, someone still assembling the philosophical and tactical framework that would eventually become his vigilante identity. By the time of The Dark Knight, Bale understood the character to have moved past that formative rage into something heavier and more psychologically taxing, the slow-dawning recognition that his war against crime, however successful in individual battles, has no realistic endpoint. This shift from youthful anger to weary endurance is subtle but consequential. Because it reframes Batman's heroism in the sequel not as an ongoing crusade fueled by passion but as a burden increasingly carried out of obligation, a distinction that colors nearly every scene in which Bruce appears throughout the film. This evolution also manifested in tangible physical choices Bale made in preparing for the role a second time. Because the redesigned batsuit used in the sequel granted significantly greater mobility and range of motion than its predecessor, Bale did not pursue the same degree of muscle mass he had built for the original film, prioritizing agility over sheer bulk. This decision reflects a broader shift in how Nolan wanted to present Batman's physicality in combat. In Batman Begins, fight choreography had been deliberately obscured and fragmented, a stylistic choice meant to convey the character from the perspective of the criminals he was terrorizing, who would experience Batman's attacks as sudden, disorienting bursts of violence rather than clearly legible martial arts sequences. With the improved suit's mobility in the sequel, Nolan had the opportunity to showcase more of Bale's training in the Keezy fighting method, a discipline built around close-quarters combat and improvisational defense, allowing the audience to see more clearly choreographed and sustained physical performance from Bale than the first film had permitted. The weight of following Nicholson. Casting the Joker presented Nolan with a challenge that went beyond ordinary casting concerns, because any actor stepping into the role would inevitably be measured against Jack Nicholson's widely beloved portrayal from Tim Burton's 1989 Batman film. Nolan understood from the outset that this comparison was unavoidable and specifically sought an actor capable of withstanding the intense scrutiny that would accompany taking on such an iconic role in a new interpretation. This search led to the announcement of Heath Ledger's casting in August 2006, a decision that was met with considerable skepticism from segments of both industry professionals and the general public, many of whom felt that Ledger, known primarily at that point for more restrained dramatic and romantic performances, was miscast for a character defined by theatrical menace. Executive producer Charles Roven later characterized Ledger as the only actor seriously considered for the role, suggesting that despite the public skepticism, the filmmakers themselves had little internal doubt about the choice once it was made, and that they anticipated the goodwill generated by Batman Begins' critical reception would help ease broader concerns about the casting once audiences had a chance to see the finished performance. Nolan's own confidence in the decision stemmed from substantive creative conversations he had with Ledger prior to casting, discussions that revealed the two men held closely aligned visions for how the character should be interpreted, giving Nolan assurance that Ledger's take on the role would align with the tonal and thematic ambitions he had for the film as a whole. Ledger's own reservations and creative framework. Ledger himself has acknowledged that he felt genuine trepidation about following Nicholson's performance, aware of the weight of expectation attached to the role, but he has also described this challenge as something that excited him creatively rather than something that made him hesitant to accept the part. His own framing of the character, describing his interpretation as a psychopathic, mass-murdering, schizophrenic clown entirely lacking empathy, makes clear that he approached the role with a specific, carefully considered conceptual framework rather than treating it as an open-ended opportunity for improvisation without direction. Central to this framework was Ledger's explicit decision to avoid humanizing the character in any conventional sense, resisting any performance choices that might invite audience sympathy or a psychologically comforting explanation for his behavior. In constructing this interpretation, Ledger drew on influences outside the Batman mythology entirely, citing the character of Alex from Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of A Clockwork Orange as a touchstone for a particular blend of charisma, unpredictability, and casual cruelty. He also looked to British punk musicians Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious, figures whose public personas were built around a deliberate, performative disregard for social convention and a kind of anarchic energy that translated well into a character whose menace derives partly from his refusal to operate according to recognizable rules of behavior. An immersive, isolating preparation process. Ledger's preparation for the role involved an unusually solitary and intensive process. He spent approximately a month secluding himself in a hotel room, during which he immersed himself in relevant comic book source material to absorb the character's various historical depictions and distill his own interpretation from that accumulated research. This isolation appears to have been a deliberate methodological choice, allowing him to develop his conception of the character away from outside influence or pressure, working through the psychological and behavioral texture of the role largely on his own terms before bringing it to set. Among the specific technical choices Ledger made during this period was his approach to the character's voice, which he constructed by blending higher and lower-pitched vocal registers in a manner inspired by ventriloquist performance techniques, producing a voice that could shift unpredictably in tone and register within a single line of dialogue, reinforcing the character's unstable, difficult-to-pin-down quality. His approach to the character's physicality in combat situations was similarly designed around unpredictability, with his fighting style deliberately choreographed to appear loose, erratic, and improvised rather than following the more disciplined, legible movement patterns typical of trained martial artists, reinforcing the sense that this character operates according to instinct and impulse rather than method or training. Beyond this initial period of seclusion, Ledger extended his preparation over a further 4 months by compiling what became known as a Joker diary, an assembled collection of images, notes, and reference material he believed would help inform and reinforce his performance. Details that have emerged about the diary's contents, including his inclusion of material reflecting the character's capacity to find serious and tragic subjects, such as disease, sources of dark amusement, illustrate just how thoroughly Ledger sought to inhabit a worldview built around inverted moral responses, finding humor and entertainment in circumstances that would provoke horror or grief in an ordinary person. The personal cost of the performance. Ledger's own reflections on the demands of the role reveal the significant psychological and physical toll this preparation and performance exacted on him. He has described the experience as among the most enjoyable creative work of his career, a characterization that might seem to sit uneasily alongside his simultaneous acknowledgement of how exhausting the process proved to be, leaving him physically and mentally depleted by the end of individual days of filming, at times unable to move or speak once a day's work concluded. This combination of genuine creative satisfaction and severe exhaustion speaks to the intensity of the immersive method he employed, an approach that clearly demanded enormous energy even as it produced a performance he found deeply rewarding to create. In a separate interview given in November 2007, while production was underway, Ledger discussed a broader pattern in his approach to acting generally, noting that fully committing himself to a role tended to interfere with his ability to relax mentally, resulting in significant sleep disruption during filming, with reported nights of only about 2 hours of rest. While this comment reflected a pattern Ledger described as characteristic of his process across multiple roles rather than something unique to the Joker specifically, its proximity to the demands of this particular performance has understandably drawn considerable attention and reflection in discussions of the film's production history. Searching for Harvey Dent. The search for an actor to play Harvey Dent proceeded according to a distinct set of criteria that Nolan articulated clearly to those involved in casting. He wanted someone who could project an all-American, wholesome heroic quality, a comparison he drew explicitly to actor Robert Redford's classic leading man persona, but combined with an underlying suggestion of anger or darkness that could plausibly be drawn out and intensified as the character's arc progressed. This combination of surface charisma and latent volatility was essential to the character's eventual transformation, feeling like a believable extension of traits already present, rather than an arbitrary personality shift imposed by trauma alone. Before Aaron Eckhart was cast, several other actors were considered for the role, including Josh Lucas, Ryan Philippe, and Mark Ruffalo, each bringing different qualities that might have served the character differently had they been cast. Matt Damon was also considered a strong candidate but was ultimately unable to commit to the production due to scheduling conflicts with other projects. Nolan's eventual selection of Eckhart reflected his judgment that the actor possessed precisely the combination of qualities the role demanded, a natural, all-American charm paired with what Nolan described as the aura of a fundamentally good man who has been pushed beyond his breaking point, a description that effectively summarizes the character's entire arc in a single phrase. Eckhart's interpretive approach. Eckhart himself found the challenge of portraying morally conflicted characters to be a source of genuine creative interest, and his own articulation of the distinction between Dent and Batman offers useful insight into how he approached building the character's psychology. He characterized the essential difference between the two men not as a matter of differing goals, since both are ultimately devoted to protecting Gotham from criminal predation, but rather as a difference in the degree to which each is willing to extend his methods beyond conventional limits in pursuit of that shared goal. Following Dent's transformation into Two-Face, Eckhart understood the character as remaining fundamentally a crime fighter in his own mind, but one who has come to resent and reject the restrictions imposed by legitimate legal process, taking his methods to an extreme that Batman, for all his own willingness to operate outside the law, still refuses to cross by adhering to his rule against killing. In developing his performance, Eckhart drew on real historical inspiration from the Kennedy family, and Robert F. Kennedy in particular, whose public career combating organized crime as a government official was similarly animated by an idealistic conception of the law and its capacity to deliver justice against entrenched criminal power. This real-world touchstone gave Eckhart a grounded reference point for portraying Dent's pre-transformation idealism as something rooted in genuine conviction rather than superficial political charisma, reinforcing the character's credibility as a figure Gotham citizens might plausibly rally behind as a symbol of hope. Rejecting a campier Two-Face. When Eckhart and Nolan turned to the question of how to visually and tonally render Dent's transformation into Two-Face, they made a conscious decision to distance their interpretation from a prior cinematic version of the character, specifically the portrayal delivered by Tommy Lee Jones in the 1995 film Batman Forever. That earlier depiction had rendered the character with a distinctly theatrical, almost cartoonish visual sensibility, including brightly colored hair and a flamboyantly split designer suit dividing the character's two halves in an exaggerated, stylized fashion. Eckhart and Nolan agreed this approach would be entirely incompatible with the grounded, realistic tone the rest of the film had worked to establish, and instead opted for a more restrained, believable rendering, a suit in muted, neutral tones with a subtly burnt or damaged quality on the disfigured side, an aesthetic choice that kept the character's transformation visually consistent with the film's broader commitment to plausibility over spectacle. This decision reinforced the sense that Dent's disfigurement and psychological unraveling were meant to be read as tragic and disturbing rather than theatrically villainous, in keeping with the film's overall treatment of his arc as a genuine human tragedy rather than a conventional supervillain origin. Gary Oldman's own characterization of his role as Lieutenant, later Commissioner, Gordon offers a useful summary of the character's function within the film's broader ensemble. Oldman described Gordon as the moral center of the story, a designation that speaks to the character's role as an honest, incorruptible figure operating within an institution, the Gotham City Police Department, that is otherwise substantially compromised by corruption. Yet Oldman's framing also acknowledges that Gordon's integrity is not presented as effortless or absolute. The character is shown grappling meaningfully with the limits of his own morality, forced repeatedly into difficult tactical compromises, including deceiving his own colleagues and staging his apparent death, in service of protecting his family and pursuing justice through means that occasionally strain against strict notions of honesty. This tension between Gordon's fundamental decency and the pragmatic compromises his circumstances demand of him gives the character a more textured moral position than a simple, uncomplicated portrayal of incorruptibility would have allowed. Recasting Rachel Dawes. The role of Rachel Dawes underwent a significant casting change between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, with Maggie Gyllenhaal stepping into the part previously played by Katie Holmes. This transition occurred because Holmes chose to pursue a role in a different project, the crime comedy Mad Money, released in 2008, rather than reprise her role in the Batman sequel. Rather than attempting to closely match or reference Holmes's earlier performance, Gyllenhaal approached Rachel essentially as a new character, building her own interpretation without treating continuity of performance style as a primary consideration. Nolan's own conception of Rachel's narrative function emphasized her role as the emotional connective tissue linking Bruce Wayne and Harvey Dent, a character whose ultimate purpose within the story's structure was to serve as a further, devastating personal loss that would fuel Bruce's psychological journey. Despite this somewhat structurally subordinate role within the plot's larger design, Gyllenhaal actively collaborated with Nolan on shaping the character's specific depiction, driven by her own desire to ensure that Rachel felt substantive and meaningful to audiences even within what amounted to a comparatively limited amount of screen time relative to the film's central figures. Casting footnotes, roads not taken. Beyond the film's principal roles, several smaller casting details illustrate the broader logistics and occasional happenstance involved in assembling the finished ensemble. Musician Dwight Yoakam was considered for a role as either the bank manager seen in the film's opening heist sequence or as one of the corrupt police officers appearing later in the story, but he ultimately declined the opportunity due to prior commitments recording his album of Buck Owens cover material, released in 2007. Separately, Hong Kong actor Edison Chen had originally been cast in a role within the film, but the majority of his material was removed from the finished cut following his involvement in a widely publicized personal scandal involving leaked private photographs, an episode that led to the diminishment of his presence in the completed film regardless of whatever contribution his performance might otherwise have made to the finished picture. A cast built through deliberation. Taken together, these accounts of casting and preparation reveal a production defined by unusually careful, deliberate decision-making at nearly every stage, from Nolan's insistence on finding a Joker who could withstand inevitable comparisons to a beloved predecessor, to the specific qualities sought in an actor to embody Harvey Dent's dual nature, to the conscious rejection of a more theatrical prior interpretation of Two-Face in favor of grounded restraint. Ledger's extraordinarily immersive preparation process, in particular, stands as one of the more thoroughly documented examples of committed character work in modern studio filmmaking, and the intensity of that process has become inseparable from how audiences and critics have come to understand and evaluate the performance's lasting impact. Across the ensemble, the consistent through line is a cast and creative team unwilling to settle for surface-level interpretations of familiar characters, choosing instead to root even the film's most fantastical elements in psychologically grounded, carefully researched performance choices, the search for a new kind of Gotham. Before a single frame of The Dark Knight was shot, the production faced a foundational question that would shape nearly every subsequent creative decision. What should Gotham City look like in a sequel that needed to feel meaningfully different from its predecessor while remaining recognizably part of the same cinematic world? Location scouting began in October 2006 and ranged widely across the United Kingdom, taking the production team through Liverpool, Glasgow, London, and portions of Yorkshire, alongside parallel scouting efforts in several American cities. This breadth of searching reflects how seriously Nolan and his collaborators treated the question of Gotham's visual identity, understanding that the city itself would function as more than mere backdrop. It needed to embody the film's thematic concerns as concretely as any of its characters. Nolan's eventual decision to center production in Chicago was driven by a combination of aesthetic and practical considerations. He was personally drawn to the city and believed its architecture offered a distinctive visual character without carrying the immediate, almost reflexive recognizability of a city like New York, whose skyline and streets are so heavily associated with countless other films that using it risked constantly reminding audiences they were watching a movie shot in a familiar, overexposed location. Chicago offered something rarer, a genuinely striking urban environment that could be photographed extensively without breaking the illusion that audiences were looking at a wholly fictional metropolis. This calculation reveals a sophisticated understanding of how location choice affects audience immersion, particularly for a story working hard to ground its comic book premise in a sense of tangible, lived-in reality. Chicago's suitability was reinforced by a practical factor established during the production of Batman Begins. The city's authorities had proven remarkably accommodating to the earlier film's needs, permitting extensive disruptions to daily urban life, including the closure of roads, freeways, and bridges, cooperation that gave Nolan confidence the city would extend similar support for the more ambitious production demands of the sequel. This continuity of institutional goodwill between the two films meant the production could build on established relationships and logistical precedents rather than starting entirely from scratch in negotiating the complex permissions required for large-scale urban filming. from natural wilderness to structured urbanity. The choice of Chicago also reflected a deliberate thematic pivot away from the visual vocabulary Nolan had established in Batman Begins. That earlier film had drawn much of its imagery from remote, natural settings, including sequences set in the Himalayan mountains and extended scenes filmed in cavernous underground spaces beneath Wayne Manor. For the sequel, Nolan wanted to trade this vocabulary of untamed natural scale for something built, structured, and man-made, a shift that aligned precisely with the kind of adversary the story was introducing. The Joker, as a character defined by his desire to dismantle existing order rather than exist within a wild, ungoverned landscape, needed a city that itself represented order and structure, precisely so that his campaign of destruction would register as a violation of something coherent rather than an extension of already existing chaos. Production designer Nathan Crowley articulated this thinking directly, noting that Chicago's characteristically clean, geometrically ordered architectural lines served the urban crime drama sensibility the filmmakers were pursuing, providing a visual backdrop of apparent civic order and rational planning that the Joker's chaos could meaningfully disrupt. Crowley's observation that Batman's presence had, within the film's internal fiction, helped improve conditions within the city adds an important layer to this visual philosophy. Gotham as rendered through Chicago's architecture was meant to suggest a city already trending toward functional order, making the introduction of an adversary determined to unravel that fragile progress feel like a genuine threat to real, if incomplete, civic improvement rather than simply more of the same endemic disorder audiences had already witnessed in the previous film. This shift in setting also carried direct consequences for Bruce Wayne's personal circumstances within the story. Because Wayne Manor had been destroyed by fire at the conclusion of Batman Begins, the production had a built-in narrative justification to relocate Bruce into an entirely different kind of living space for the sequel, and the filmmakers chose to place him in a strikingly modern, sparsely furnished penthouse apartment. This choice of setting was not merely a practical solution to the loss of his previous home but a meaningful visual expression of Bruce's psychological state, using the penthouse's clean, minimalist emptiness to reflect his increasing isolation and loneliness as a character increasingly cut off from ordinary domestic life by the demands of his double identity. Practical solutions for impractical problems. Despite this broader move toward location shooting in real urban environments, certain elements of the production still required constructed sets, most notably the underground facility that replaced the original Batcave from the previous film, informally referred to during production as the Bat Bunker, situated on the outskirts of the city rather than beneath Wayne's new residence. The production team seriously considered an alternative approach, placing this equivalent space in the basement beneath Wayne's new penthouse, but ultimately rejected this option as insufficiently plausible given the practical realities of urban high-rise construction and the logistical difficulties of maintaining a hidden underground facility of the scale the story required directly beneath a modern residential tower. This decision reflects the production's consistent commitment to maintaining internal plausibility even in service of a fundamentally fantastical premise, prioritizing believability over narrative convenience wherever a workable alternative could be found. The IMAX gamble. Among the most consequential technical decisions made during pre-production was Nolan's pursuit of large-format IMAX cinematography for substantial portions of the film. While the bulk of The Dark Knight was captured using Panavision's Panaflex Millennium XL and Platinum camera systems, standard professional equipment well suited to conventional 35mm production, Nolan wanted to shoot roughly 40 minutes of footage using IMAX cameras, a specialized technology built around 70mm film stock that offered dramatically higher resolution and a significantly larger projected image than the industry-standard format. The finished film ultimately incorporated a smaller but still historically significant portion of this footage, amounting to between 15 and 20% of the runtime, translating to approximately 28 minutes presented in the expanded IMAX format. This decision made The Dark Knight the first major narrative motion picture to incorporate IMAX cinematography in this manner, a genuinely novel application of technology that had, up to that point, been employed almost exclusively for documentary filmmaking, where its enormous image fidelity suited educational and immersive non-fiction content rather than the demands of a scripted narrative feature with complex blocking, dialogue, and continuity requirements. Warner Brothers, as the studio financing the production, expressed considerable reluctance to endorse this experimental approach, and their hesitation was grounded in legitimate practical concerns. The IMAX cameras themselves were exceptionally large and cumbersome compared to standard film equipment, posing genuine challenges for the kind of mobile, dynamic camera work modern action filmmaking typically demands, and the cost of purchasing and processing the specialized 70mm film stock ran as much. As 4 times higher than equivalent 35mm production costs, a substantial budgetary consideration for a studio already committing $185 million to the production. Nolan's response to these concerns reflected his characteristic confidence in pursuing technically ambitious solutions, reportedly framing his argument in terms of the technology's proven durability, noting that cameras capable of functioning in the extreme conditions of Mount Everest expeditions could certainly be adapted for the comparatively more controlled demands of a studio production. To validate this confidence and address the studio's legitimate practical concerns, Nolan had cinematographer Wally Pfister and members of the camera crew begin dedicated training with the IMAX equipment as early as January 2007, several months before principal photography began, allowing the production to work through unfamiliar technical challenges and establish reliable workflows before committing to using the format on footage that would appear in the finished film. Nolan's specific desire to shoot the film's opening bank heist sequence using IMAX cameras carried clear strategic logic beyond simple visual ambition. By opening the film with footage capturing a scale and clarity audiences had never previously experienced in a traditional narrative feature, Nolan could immediately signal to viewers, from the very first sequence, that The Dark Knight represented a meaningful expansion in scope and ambition compared to Batman Begins, establishing this distinction through the audience's direct sensory experience of the footage itself rather than relying solely on marketing messaging or narrative exposition to convey the sequel's heightened scale. Beginning production under a false name. Principal photography commenced on April 18, 2007, based in Chicago, operating under the full $185 million budget allocated to the production. Cinematographer Wally Pfister approached the film's visual palette by deliberately blending elements from his work on 2 previous projects. The somewhat rust-toned, weathered visual quality he had established for Batman Begins, combined with the cooler, dusk-inflected color scheme, built around cobalt blues, greens, blacks, and whites, that had characterized his earlier work with Nolan on The Prestige. This blended approach carried a specific corrective purpose as well, addressing feedback that certain sequences in Batman Begins had suffered from being excessively dark and difficult to visually parse, a technical lesson Pfister and Nolan sought to apply more carefully in the sequel's cinematography. In an effort to avoid the kind of intense public and media attention that inevitably surrounds a major studio production, particularly one involving a recently deceased actor's controversial casting, the Chicago production operated under a deliberately misleading working title, Rory's First Kiss, a cover identity clearly designed to disguise the project's true nature from casual observers and curious onlookers. This attempt at secrecy proved short-lived, as media outlets quickly identified the production's actual identity despite the misdirection, illustrating the practical limits of concealment for a production operating at this scale and visibility within a major American city. An additional creative detail from this period concerns the production of the Joker's homemade video messages that appear at various points within the finished film, sequences that were filmed and substantially directed by Ledger himself rather than following conventional directorial oversight for these particular segments. Michael Caine has recounted an anecdote from the filming of one such video sequence, describing how Ledger's performance proved so striking and unsettling in the moment that Caine, despite his considerable experience and professionalism as a performer, found himself forgetting his own lines entirely, a testament to the intensity Ledger brought even to comparatively contained, technically simple segments of the production. Filming the opening heist. The bank heist sequence that opens the finished film was, notably, the very first scene filmed during production, an unusual sequencing choice driven by specific technical and logistical considerations. Shot within the historic old Chicago main post office building over a 5-day period, this sequence was deliberately scheduled at the outset of production specifically to test the practical workflow of the IMAX filming process while there remained sufficient time in the schedule to reshoot the material using conventional cameras had the experimental format proven unworkable. This scheduling decision also served a secondary marketing purpose, since the sequence was intended for early public release as part of the film's broader promotional campaign, giving audiences an advanced taste of the finished film's visual ambitions well before the full theatrical release. Pfister has described this initial week of filming as demanding considerable patience, largely because the specialized processing required for IMAX footage introduced a 4-day waiting period before the crew could review what they had actually captured, a significant departure from the more immediate feedback loop typical of standard digital or conventional film workflows, and one that required the production to trust its technical preparation rather than relying on quick verification of results. Building Wayne's World within real buildings. Several key interior sequences were filmed within existing Chicago buildings repurposed to serve the story's fictional locations. The lobby of one Illinois center was transformed into Bruce Wayne's penthouse apartment, with custom-built bookcases constructed specifically to conceal the building's actual elevators from camera view, maintaining the illusion of a self-contained private residence. A separate floor within 2 Illinois Center was elaborately decorated to serve as the setting for Wayne's fundraising event, the sequence marking the first direct encounter between Batman and the Joker within the narrative. Crew members involved in filming this particular sequence have been described as experiencing genuine excitement given the significance of this confrontation within the story's structure. In both of these interior locations, the production covered the building's actual windows with green screen material, a technique that allowed visual effects artists to digitally composite appropriate Gotham City skyline imagery into the finished footage during post-production, seamlessly integrating real interior spaces with an entirely fictional exterior urban environment. Chasing through the loop. Among the most logistically demanding sequences filmed during production was the extended truck chase, which required approximately 3 weeks of dedicated filming, concentrated primarily along Wacker Drive, a distinctive multi-level roadway running through downtown Chicago that had to be closed to normal traffic overnight to accommodate the production's needs. During the filming of this sequence, Nolan made the creative decision to incorporate an additional set piece not originally planned, involving a SWAT van crashing through a concrete barricade, an addition that speaks to the somewhat organic, evolving nature of the production's approach to staging its major action sequences even once filming was already underway. The chase sequence's geography extended beyond Wacker Drive to include LaSalle Street, a location that served double duty within the production, also standing in for the site of the Gotham City Police Department's funeral procession sequence depicted elsewhere in the film. This same stretch of roadway accommodated the sequence's signature practical stunt, the flipping of an 18-wheeler truck, filmed using genuine practical effects rather than digital simulation, alongside an accompanying helicopter sequence captured in the same general vicinity. Additional segments contributing to this extended chase and its surrounding material were filmed along Monroe Street and Randolph Street, as well as at the Randolph Street rail station, illustrating just how extensively the production wove together multiple distinct locations across downtown Chicago to construct what would appear on screen as a single continuous sequence of urban pursuit. Ferries on the water. The climactic sequence involving the 2 evacuation ferries, central to the film's exploration of civic morality under extreme duress, was filmed at Navy, PA, situated along the shore of Lake Michigan, standing in for the fictional Gotham Harbor. The production initially hoped to secure actual vessels appropriate for the scene's requirements, and location scouts spent more than a month searching for suitable ferries that could be used in filming, but this search ultimately proved unsuccessful. Faced with this obstacle, construction coordinator Joe Ondrako and his team pursued an alternative practical solution, building complete ferry facades mounted atop barges, a construction approach that allowed the production to achieve the visual scale and presence of full-sized vessels without requiring the acquisition of actual functioning ferries. Despite the scene's narrative complexity and thematic weight within the finished film, the entire sequence was captured within a single day of filming, an efficient production achievement given that it involved coordinating roughly 800 background performers, who had to be processed through makeup and wardrobe departments in staggered shifts to manage the sheer logistical scale of costuming and preparing such a large group of extras for filming. The final confrontation and a refused building. Exterior footage representing the fictional Gotham Pruitt building, the site of the film's climactic confrontation between Batman and the Joker, was captured at the site of the Trump International Hotel and Tower, which remained under active construction at the time of filming. The building's actual owners declined to grant permission for a specific planned stunt sequence involving Batman suspending members of a SWAT team from the exterior of the structure, a refusal that required the production to find an alternative solution, ultimately filming this particular stunt element from the 40th floor of an entirely separate construction site elsewhere in the city rather than at the location intended to represent the Pruitt building itself. A demolition repurposed. The sequence depicting the destruction of Gotham General Hospital, one of the film's most visually striking practical effects achievements, was filmed in August 2007 at a former Bratsch's candy factory located on Cicero Avenue, a building that had already been scheduled for demolition independent of the production's needs. This fortunate alignment of timing allowed the filmmakers to stage a genuine, large-scale practical explosion using a structure that was destined for destruction regardless of the film's involvement, providing spectacular, authentic footage of building demolition without requiring the production to bear the cost or environmental impact of demolishing a structure solely for cinematic purposes. Principal photography in Chicago concluded on September 1, with the final sequences filmed depicting Bruce Wayne driving and subsequently crashing his vehicle, before the production departed once more for additional filming in England. A city rendered in detail. The finished film draws on an extensive catalogue of specific Chicago locations woven throughout its runtime. Lake Michigan itself appears not only as Gotham Harbor but also, in an entirely different capacity, standing in for the Caribbean Sea during a sequence depicting Wayne boarding a seaplane. The Richard J. Daley Center provided both exterior shots representing Wayne Enterprises and interior courtroom sequences central to the film's legal and prosecutorial subplot. The Berghoff restaurant served as a location for sequences depicting police arrests of mobsters, while additional Chicago establishments including Twin Anchors Restaurant and the Sound Bar contributed further location work. McCormick Place provided interior spaces representing Wayne Enterprises offices, and the historic Chicago Theater contributed additional location value to the production. The building at 330 North Wabash served multiple narrative functions simultaneously, standing in as the office spaces used by Harvey Dent, Mayor Garcia, and Commissioner Lubb, while its 13th floor was repurposed to represent Wayne Enterprises' boardroom. For this particular space, Pfister worked to enhance the location's already substantial panoramic windows and abundant natural light, incorporating an 80-foot glass table and strategically placed reflective lighting fixtures to maximize the visual impact of the space's architectural features. A parking garage on Randolph Street provided the setting for the sequence in which Batman apprehends both Scarecrow, reprising his role from the previous film, and a group of impersonators attempting to emulate Batman's vigilante methods. For this scene, Nolan specifically wanted to incorporate several Rottweiler dogs, though the production encountered genuine difficulty locating a single handler capable of simultaneously managing multiple dogs during filming, illustrating an unexpectedly mundane logistical challenge within an otherwise elaborate production. A memorable sequence depicting Batman surveying the city from a rooftop edge was filmed atop Willis Tower, at the time Chicago's tallest building, providing a genuinely vertiginous vantage point for this contemplative moment. Although stuntman Buster Reeves had originally been designated to perform this sequence as Bale's double, Bale successfully persuaded the filmmaking team to allow him to perform the scene himself, a request that speaks to his personal investment in fully inhabiting the physical demands of the role rather than relying entirely on stunt performers for sequences involving genuine physical risk. An economic footnote. Beyond its creative and technical achievements, the production's extended presence in Chicago carried tangible economic consequences for the city itself. The 13 weeks the production spent filming in Chicago has been estimated to have generated approximately $45 million in economic activity for the local economy, alongside the creation of thousands of jobs for local workers and businesses supporting the production, a substantial material benefit that helps explain the continued willingness of Chicago's civic authorities to accommodate large-scale film productions of this kind, extending a relationship of mutual benefit that had already been established during the filming of Batman Begins several years earlier, building the Bat Bunker in a Zeppelin hangar. While Chicago provided the bulk of the production's location-based exterior work, a substantial portion of the Dark Knight's interior filming took place on constructed sets at two English facilities, Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire and Cardington Airfield in Bedfordshire, the latter a site historically associated with airship construction and possessing the kind of cavernous interior space that made it suitable for large-scale set building. Among the most significant sets constructed at Cardington was the Bat Bunker, the underground facility that replaced the original Batcave from the previous film, a build that required 6 weeks of dedicated construction work within one of the airfield's massive hangars. The design of this set drew specifically on architectural references from 1960s Chicago building design, a choice that reinforced visual continuity with the film's broader commitment to grounding Gotham's fictional geography in recognizable, historically specific American urban architecture rather than a generically futuristic or abstractly stylized vision of a secret headquarters. The construction team integrated the set directly into the hangar's existing concrete flooring, and made deliberate use of the space's substantial scale, working with a footprint measuring 200 feet in length and ceilings reaching 8 feet in height to create a sense of broad, expansive perspective appropriate to a facility meant to feel both functional and imposing. An unexpected technical challenge arose from the hangar's overall height, which at 160 feet proved poorly suited to directly suspending the substantial roof structure the Bat Bunker set required. The production solution involved constructing an encompassing gantry system capable of supporting both the roof structure itself and the extensive lighting rigs necessary to properly illuminate the set for filming. Additional English locations. Following the production's return from its initial Chicago shoot in May, additional filming in England extended to several further locations that contributed distinct sequences to the finished film. The Criterion restaurant provided the setting for the dinner sequence in which Rachel, Dent, and Wayne share a meal together, a scene carrying significant dramatic weight given the romantic and professional tensions among these three characters. A sequence depicting a Gotham news broadcast was filmed at the University of Westminster, contributing to the film's ongoing use of media coverage as a device for conveying the broader civic panic generated by the Joker's escalating campaign. The Gotham City Police Department's headquarters, a significant recurring location throughout the film, was constructed within the Farmelo building, a location repurposed to house the substantial procedural and investigative sequences centered on Gordon and his colleagues. It was within this GCPD headquarters set that one of the production's most memorable behind-the-scenes anecdotes occurred, during filming of the interrogation sequence between Batman and the Joker. According to accounts of the shoot, Ledger asked Bale to physically strike him during the scene, seeking a more visceral, authentic reaction for the sequence's escalating physical intensity. Bale declined this request, but Ledger nonetheless brought considerable physical commitment to his own performance, reportedly throwing himself against the set's walls with enough force to crack and dent the surrounding surfaces, an illustration of the intensity Ledger consistently brought to his physical performance choices even in a sequence built primarily around dialogue and psychological confrontation rather than conventional action. After a period back in Chicago, the production returned to England in mid-September to complete interior work for several of the film's climactic sequences, including material related to the ferry confrontation, the hospital explosion sequence, and the interior spaces of the fictional Gotham Pruitt building where Batman's final confrontation with the Joker takes place. By mid-October, the production had moved to Battersea Power Station, a distinctive London landmark, to film both interior and exterior sequences depicting Rachel held hostage surrounded by barrels of gasoline, one of the film's more visually tense and dangerous-seeming sequences. Because Battersea Power Station carries protected heritage status as a listed building, the production could not risk any actual damage to the structure itself despite the sequences need to convey the visual impression of explosive danger. The solution involved constructing a false wall positioned in front of the actual building and lining this temporary structure with practical explosive charges, allowing the production to capture the visual impact of a genuine explosion without endangering the protected historic building behind it. The realism of this practical effects work proved almost too convincing. Nearby residents, apparently unaware of the film production taking place in their vicinity, contacted emergency services believing they were witnessing an actual terrorist attack. A reaction that speaks both to the effectiveness of the practical effects team's work and to the genuinely unsettling nature of large-scale controlled explosions occurring in a populated urban area without adequate advance warning to the surrounding community. Filming in England concluded by the end of October with a combination of additional work, including green screen photography intended to supplement the truck chase sequence largely filmed earlier in Chicago, along with the filming of Rachel's fall from a window, a pivotal early sequence in the film's plot, captured on a constructed set at Cardington rather than on location. 9 days in Hong Kong. The production's final phase took place over 9 days in Hong Kong, a comparatively brief but logistically demanding stretch of filming given the scale of what needed to be captured. This period included aerial photography shot from atop the International Finance Center, one of Hong Kong's most prominent skyscrapers, along with additional filming at several distinctive locations throughout the city, including the central to mid-levels escalator system, the skyscraper known as the Center, the Central District more broadly, the historic Peninsula Hong Kong Hotel, and Queen's Road. Among the sequences captured during this period was a stunt depicting Batman catching an in-flight C-130 military transport aircraft, a spectacular set piece requiring careful coordination given the scale and complexity of executing such a maneuver convincingly on screen. Not every planned sequence for the Hong Kong shoot survived contact with local logistical realities. Despite the production having conducted extensive rehearsals in Chicago, including practice jumps performed by stuntman Buster Reeves from the McClure building, a planned stunt intended to show Batman leaping between two Hong Kong skyscrapers was ultimately cancelled after local authorities declined to grant permission for the helicopter use the sequence would have required. Cinematographer Wally Pfister has characterized his dealings with the relevant officials during this process in notably unflattering terms, describing the experience of trying to secure the necessary permissions as something akin to a nightmare, reflecting the genuine frustration involved in adapting an ambitious practical stunt sequence to unexpected bureaucratic obstacles in an unfamiliar jurisdiction. A separate point of dispute has arisen regarding another planned Hong Kong sequence, one depicting Batman leaping into Victoria Harbour. Media reports at the time suggested this sequence had been cancelled specifically due to concerns about water pollution in the harbor, a narrative that Nolan has directly disputed, asserting instead that the decision not to include this particular sequence reflected a straightforward creative and scriptwriting choice rather than any practical or environmental obstacle encountered during production. This discrepancy between reported explanation and the director's own account illustrates the sometimes unreliable nature of behind-the-scenes reporting surrounding high-profile productions, where practical explanations can circulate publicly even when the actual reasoning behind a given creative decision was considerably more mundane. Taken as a whole, the production's total shooting schedule extended across 127 days, concluding on November 15, 2007, a schedule the production completed both on time and under its allocated budget, a notable achievement for a film of this scale and technical ambition, particularly given the number of experimental elements, including the IMAX cinematography and numerous large-scale practical stunts, that the production had incorporated into its filming plan. Post-production work on The Dark Knight was already underway in January 2008 when Heath Ledger died at the age of 28 from an accidental overdose involving prescription medication. In the aftermath of this tragedy, a rumor began to circulate suggesting that Ledger's intense commitment to preparing for and performing the role of the Joker had contributed to a deterioration in his mental state that ultimately played a role in his death. This rumor was subsequently refuted, though its circulation at the time added an additional layer of public scrutiny and speculation to an already difficult period for the production and everyone involved with it. Nolan has spoken candidly about how profoundly this loss affected the editing process, describing the immediate period following Ledger's death as an emotionally overwhelming time to be working through footage that required looking at his performance on a daily basis during the editing process. Despite this emotional difficulty, Nolan has also expressed a sense of gratitude at having meaningful, productive work to focus on during this period, framing the responsibility of completing a performance Ledger had been genuinely proud of, and had entrusted to Nolan's direction and creative judgment, as something that gave him a constructive outlet during a period of profound grief. An important practical detail regarding the editing process concerns Nolan's general preference, as a filmmaker, for capturing usable dialogue directly during production rather than relying on additional dialogue replacement recorded separately in post-production. Because of this preference, all of Ledger's actual vocal performance had already been fully captured and completed before his death, meaning the editing team had no need to seek any posthumous re-recording or alteration of his spoken performance. Nolan has also confirmed that he made no changes to the Joker's narrative arc or characterization in response to Ledger's death, choosing to complete the film according to the creative vision that had already been established during production rather than retroactively altering the story in light of the tragedy. In recognition of the losses experienced during the making of the film, Nolan included a formal dedication both to Ledger and to stuntman Conway Wycliffe, who died during rehearsals for a stunt involving the tumbler, the armored vehicle also referred to as the Batmobile, a dedication acknowledging the human cost embedded in the production's ambitious and often physically dangerous practical effects work. An aggressive, deliberate cut. Working alongside lead editor Lee Smith, Nolan pursued what has been characterized as an aggressive editorial approach in shaping the finished film down to its eventual 152-minute runtime, a substantial length for a mainstream studio release that nonetheless reflects the sheer amount of narrative and thematic material the finished story needed to accommodate. Nolan has stated that no scenes were ultimately removed from the finished film during this editing process, explaining that he considered every scene present in the assembled footage to be essential to the finished story, with any genuinely unnecessary material having already been eliminated earlier, during the screenwriting process itself, before filming ever began. This account is reinforced by the Nolan brothers' own description of the considerable difficulty they encountered while attempting to refine the screenplay to an appropriately manageable runtime during the writing process. At certain points during this refinement process, the writers found that their efforts to trim the material had gone too far, removing so much content that the resulting narrative became genuinely difficult to follow or comprehend as a coherent story. Rather than persisting with an overly compressed version of the script, the Nolans responded to this problem by adding additional scenes back into the screenplay, a somewhat counterintuitive solution to a length problem that speaks to the genuine complexity of the story they were attempting to tell, one involving multiple interlocking character arcs, an ensemble of major and supporting characters, and a plot built around escalating, interconnected set pieces that required sufficient narrative space to develop coherently. Freedom through established realism. The design philosophy governing The Dark Knight's visual and practical effects work benefited from a creative freedom that had not been fully available during the making of Batman Begins. That earlier film had been constrained by the need to carefully calibrate how much of the character's more overtly comic book-derived iconography could be incorporated while still maintaining audience acceptance of the story's grounded, realistic tone, given that audiences at that point had not yet been introduced to this particular interpretation of Batman's world. By the time production began on The Dark Knight, audiences had already demonstrated their acceptance of this realistic approach to the material, granting the filmmaking team considerably more design latitude to pursue bolder or more elaborate practical solutions without the same degree of caution required during the franchise's initial reintroduction. Special effects supervisor Chris Corbould oversaw the substantial visual effects workload required for the finished film, which ultimately comprised approximately 700 individual effect shots, produced through the combined efforts of the visual effects company's double negative and frame store. Despite this considerable number of effect shots, the film's overall reliance on computer-generated imagery remained comparatively restrained relative to films of similar scale and genre, reflecting Nolan's consistent preference for practical, in-camera effects wherever such an approach remained feasible, reserving digital effects work specifically for circumstances where practical solutions genuinely could not achieve the desired result. Designing the Batpod. One of the most significant new practical elements introduced for the sequel was the Batpod, an entirely new vehicle distinct from the armored tumbler featured prominently in the previous film. Production designer Nathan Crowley took primary responsibility for designing this vehicle, motivated in part by Nolan's desire to avoid excessive reliance on repeating the tumbler across multiple action sequences, seeking instead a fresh visual element that could distinguish the sequel's action set pieces from already established in the franchise's opening installment. Corbould's effects team subsequently built the actual functioning vehicle used in filming, working from a prototype that Crowley and Nolan had themselves constructed by combining components sourced from various commercially available model vehicles, an unusually hands-on design process for a piece of equipment that would ultimately need to function as a genuine, rideable stunt vehicle rather than merely a static prop. The finished Batpod proved to be an unusually challenging vehicle to actually operate, owing to its unconventional, wide-tired design, and only stuntman Jean-Pierre Goy was ultimately able to successfully ride the vehicle for filming purposes, a capability he developed only after months of dedicated training given the vehicle's unusual handling characteristics compared to any conventional motorcycle or similar vehicle he might have previously operated. An explosion added on the fly. The destruction of Gotham General Hospital, one of the film's most memorable and visually striking sequences, was not originally included in the shooting script but was instead added during the course of production itself, a decision driven by Corbould's confidence that his effects team could successfully execute the ambitious practical demolition the sequence would require. This addition illustrates the somewhat fluid, collaborative nature of the production's approach to its most spectacular practical effects work, with creative opportunities identified and pursued even after filming had already commenced, provided the technical expertise existed within the production to execute them successfully. Redesigning the Batsuit. The film's costume department, working under the collaborative direction of costume designer Lindy Hemming alongside Nathan Crowley, Nolan himself, and armor designer Jamie Rama, undertook a substantial redesign of the Batsuit for the sequel, motivated by a desire to improve both the comfort and the physical flexibility of the costume compared to its predecessor. The resulting design employed a stretchy base material covered by more than 100 individual pieces of urethane armor, an approach that allowed for the enhanced range of motion that in turn permitted the more visible display of Bale's Keezy fighting technique training discussed elsewhere in accounts of the production, closing the loop between costume design and the broader creative decisions governing how the film's combat sequences were staged and photographed. Sculpting Two-Face. The design of Harvey Dent's disfigured appearance as Two-Face fell to sculptor Julian Murray, working from Nolan's specific request that the character's burnt facial design convey a distinctly skeletal quality. Murray's design process involved working through multiple iterations of this concept, with some early attempts judged to be excessively realistic and correspondingly horrifying in their visual impact, more disturbing than the finished film's tone ultimately called for. Murray eventually settled on a design striking a more calibrated balance, one he has described as somewhat more fanciful in its overall conception while still maintaining a high degree of visual detail, achieving a version of the character's disfigurement that remained genuinely unsettling without tipping into the kind of visceral horror that might have proven excessive for the finished film's intended tone. Constructing the Joker's look. Costume designer Lindy Hemming took primary responsibility for the Joker's overall visual appearance, drawing inspiration from contemporary fashion and music celebrity culture to construct a look that would feel distinctly modern and stylish rather than relying on more traditional or campier visual conventions associated with earlier depictions of the character. This contemporary sensibility was supplemented by a specific artistic reference point suggested directly by Nolan, the 1953 painting by Francis Bacon depicting a distorted, anguished interpretation of a historical papal portrait, an unconventional visual touchstone whose unsettling, distorted human quality offered a useful reference for conveying the Joker's own fundamentally unsettling nature through costume and overall visual presentation. This influence was further supplemented by more direct research into the character's various comic book appearances over the decades, blending fine art inspiration with the character's established visual history. The finished costume consists of a purple coat, a green vest, a shirt intended to convey an antique or aged quality, and a notably thin necktie evoking a 1960s style, an element that, according to accounts of the production, Ledger himself specifically suggested as an addition to the character's overall look, indicating the degree to which Ledger's creative input extended beyond pure performance into meaningful collaboration on the character's visual presentation as well, the physical scarring. Visible on the Joker's face throughout the film was the work of prosthetic supervisor Connor O'Sullivan, whose design process drew partly on his own encounter with a scarred delivery man he had met in the course of his professional work, a real-world reference point that informed the specific visual character of the scarring O'Sullivan ultimately developed for the role. O'Sullivan employed his own specialized technique in both creating and applying this prosthetic work, achieving a supple, convincingly skin-like quality intended to hold up under close camera scrutiny throughout extensive filming. The Joker's makeup, meanwhile, fell under the direction of John Callione Jr., who designed what has been described as an intentionally organic appearance, meant to convey the impression that the character had been wearing this makeup continuously for an extended period rather than freshly applying it, an idea again partly informed by additional reference to Francis Bacon's body of work. Callione Jr.'s application technique drew on established theatrical makeup traditions, and involved an unusual practical method. He would instruct Ledger to scrunch his face into various contorted positions during the application process, so that once Ledger relaxed his facial muscles after the makeup had set, the resulting surface would naturally display the cracks and uneven textures Callione Jr. was seeking to achieve, creating a convincingly worn, imperfect quality to the finished look rather than a smooth, freshly painted appearance. Notably, Ledger insisted on applying the character's distinctive lipstick himself throughout filming, regarding this specific element of the makeup application as an essential component of his own process for embodying the character, a small but telling detail that speaks to how thoroughly Ledger involved himself in every dimension of the Joker's construction, extending his creative ownership of the role from vocal performance and physical movement all the way down to the smallest details of his own makeup application. When Christopher Nolan approached the question of who should compose the score for The Dark Knight, his decision to retain both James Newton Howard and Hans Zimmer, the composing team responsible for Batman Begins, reflected a deliberate philosophy about how music functions within a multi-film narrative. Nolan believed it was essential to preserve a sense of musical continuity between the two films, understanding that a sequel's score needed to feel like a natural extension and deepening of an established sonic world rather than an entirely fresh start disconnected from what audiences had already absorbed emotionally in the previous installment. This decision to bridge what might be called the musical narrative gap between the two films speaks to a broader recognition, evident throughout the production, that Gotham's world needed to feel like a continuous, coherent reality across multiple films rather than a series of loosely connected, tonally inconsistent installments. The actual recording of the score took place at Air Studios in London, a facility with a long-established reputation for large-scale orchestral film scoring work, providing the technical infrastructure necessary to realize the ambitious combination of orchestral and electronic elements the composers ultimately pursued for this particular project. Composing blind. One of the more unusual aspects of the creative process behind the score involved the composer's relationship to the finished visual material of the film itself. Rather than working from completed footage, tailoring musical cues to specific edited sequences in the conventional manner of film scoring, Howard and Zimmer composed substantial portions of their music without having seen the film in its assembled form. This was not simply a matter of scheduling constraints but reflected a specific creative preference on Nolan's part. He wanted his composers to be shaped primarily by their understanding of the characters and the underlying story rather than by the specific rhythm, pacing, and visual choices of particular edited scenes. This approach suggests a belief that music generated in response to character and narrative themes, rather than reactive scoring calibrated to match precise on-screen action, would produce a more thematically coherent and emotionally resonant result, one less concerned with hitting specific dramatic beats moment to moment and more concerned with establishing an overarching musical identity for each character, an idea that could then be woven into the finished film during the editing process. Dividing the work by character. Rather than collaborating on every musical cue jointly, Howard and Zimmer divided their compositional responsibilities according to character, an arrangement that allowed each composer to develop a distinct musical voice for different aspects of the story rather than attempting to blend their individual styles into a single undifferentiated sound. Howard took primary responsibility for music associated with Harvey Dent, while Zimmer focused his efforts on the musical identities of both Batman and the Joker, giving him responsibility for the film's two most diametrically opposed figures and the corresponding challenge of finding a musical vocabulary capable of representing both a symbol of vigilante justice and an agent of pure ideological chaos within the same overall score. Reimagining Batman's musical identity. Zimmer's approach to composing Batman's musical theme reflected a specific interpretive stance on the character that departed from more conventional expectations for how a superhero's theme might typically sound. Rather than treating Batman as an uncomplicated figure of heroic virtue deserving a triumphant, unambiguously noble musical signature, Zimmer approached the character with a more ambivalent understanding of his moral position within the story, one that acknowledged the increasingly compromised and ethically fraught nature of his methods as the narrative progressed. This interpretive choice led Zimmer to deliberately avoid composing a theme that sounded conventionally heroic or, in his own framing, overtly super in character, seeking instead a musical identity that carried a more restrained, weightier, and morally complicated quality befitting a character whose actions throughout the film increasingly blur the line between heroism and vigilante overreach. Howard's contribution to the score, centered on Harvey Dent, comprised approximately 10 minutes of composed music dedicated specifically to the character's arc, a substantial allocation given the character's dual nature across the film's runtime as both Gotham's celebrated district attorney and, following his transformation, the vengeful Two-Face. Howard conceived of Dent musically as a representative American figure embodying genuine hope and idealism, a musical characterization that needed to accommodate the character's subsequent passage through profound emotional trauma and eventual moral corruption without abandoning the thematic material established for his earlier, more virtuous incarnation. To achieve this musical continuity across such a dramatic character transformation, Howard employed brass instrumentation to represent both ends of Dent's moral trajectory, using the same essential instrumental family to score both the idealistic prosecutor and his corrupted alter ego. Rather than introducing entirely new instrumentation to signal Dent's fall, Howard instead manipulated and distorted the existing brass-based thematic material as the character's corruption progressed, warping the sound in ways that convey psychological deterioration while retaining an audible connection back to the character's earlier, more hopeful musical identity. This approach mirrors, in purely musical terms, the same logic that governed the makeup and costume design choices for Dent's transformation. Rather than replacing one identity wholesale with something unrecognizable, the goal was to show a continuous character undergoing a devastating but traceable corruption. Audible proof that the film's tragedy lies precisely in Dent's corrupted state remaining recognizably connected to who he once was. Zimmer's approach to composing the Joker's musical theme began with an extraordinarily ambitious conceptual goal. He initially wanted to represent the character using a single sustained musical note, one capable of conveying an escalating emotional journey entirely through subtle manipulation of that one tone. Zimmer has described his intended effect in vivid terms, imagining a note that would begin with a quality of slight agitation, gradually intensify into a more serious level of aggravation, and ultimately culminate in an overwhelming, visceral intensity by its conclusion. This ambition reflects an unusually minimalist and conceptually rigorous approach to character theming, seeking to strip away conventional melodic or harmonic development entirely in favor of pure textural and dynamic transformation within a single sustained pitch. Despite the conceptual elegance of this idea, Zimmer found that he could not successfully realize a single-note theme capable of achieving the effect he envisioned, and he ultimately arrived at a modified approach built around two notes rather than one, employing alternating tempos between them to create a sense of unstable, unpredictable rhythmic movement. This two-note structure was further shaped by an explicit punk rock influence, an aesthetic sensibility built around rawness, aggression, and a deliberate rejection of conventional musical polish, qualities that suited a character defined by his own rejection of social convention and predictable behavior. Kraftwerk, The Damned, and the Joker's sonic identity. The specific sonic character of the Joker's theme drew on an unusual combination of influences that Zimmer brought together from different corners of his own musical background. He cited the pioneering electronic music group Kraftwerk, whose work throughout the 1970s helped establish foundational techniques and aesthetic approaches for electronic composition, as a significant reference point for the theme's more mechanical, unnervingly precise textural qualities. Alongside this influence, Zimmer also drew on his own prior professional experience working with the British punk rock band The Damned, a connection that brought a more visceral, aggressive rock sensibility into conversation with the colder, more clinical electronic textures inspired by Kraftwerk's innovations. Zimmer's stated goal in combining these seemingly disparate influences was to musically convey specific qualities he associated with the character himself: a sense of corrosion, evoking decay, and the gradual undermining of established order, a sense of recklessness, reflecting the character's apparent disregard for consequence or self-preservation, and a sense of what Zimmer described as otherworldliness, a quality suggesting the character exists somehow outside normal human categories of motivation and understanding. To achieve this combination, Zimmer blended electronic and orchestral instrumentation together rather than treating them as separate, competing sonic palettes, and he went through an unusually meticulous process of modifying nearly every individual note within the recorded theme during post-production, applying various sound processing techniques to make the finished music evoke sounds beyond the range of any traditional musical instrument, including effects intended to suggest the crack of thunder and the sharp, unsettling quality of razors. Training musicians to work against their instincts. In pursuing original electronic textures for the Joker's theme, Zimmer worked extensively with synthesizers to develop sounds that did not already exist within conventional orchestral or popular music vocabulary, seeking a genuinely off-putting quality that would register to listeners as instinctively unsettling rather than merely unfamiliar. One particularly demanding technique Zimmer employed involved instructing the musicians he worked with to begin sustaining a single note and then gradually, almost imperceptibly, shift their pitch toward a second note over an extended duration of approximately 3 minutes. This exercise proved genuinely difficult for the musicians involved, precisely because it ran counter to their fundamental training as performers. Musical education typically emphasizes precise, controlled pitch accuracy and clearly articulated transitions between notes. Zimmer's request instead demanded an almost imperceptibly gradual slide between two pitches, a technique that deliberately avoided the clean, controlled execution these musicians had spent years developing as core professional skills. The resulting difficulty musicians experienced in executing this unconventional technique illustrates just how deliberately Zimmer was working against established musical convention in service of creating a genuinely unfamiliar and destabilizing sonic experience appropriate to the character's disruptive narrative function. Achieving the specific quality Zimmer was seeking through this technique required several months of iterative work and refinement, reflecting the considerable technical and creative difficulty involved in translating his conceptual vision into a finished, usable piece of recorded music. Grief and the question of honoring a performance. Following Heath Ledger's death during the post-production period, Zimmer found himself confronting a difficult creative question regarding the Joker's musical theme he had worked so extensively to develop. He considered, at least momentarily, whether it might be more appropriate to abandon the unconventional, deliberately unsettling theme he and his collaborators had labored over and replace it with something more traditional and conventional in its musical construction, a more straightforward villain theme perhaps less demanding and unusual in its execution. Ultimately, both Zimmer and Howard concluded that the more fitting response to Ledger's death was to preserve and honor the specific musical work they had developed in direct response to his performance, rather than retreating to a safer, more conventional alternative. This decision reflects a broader pattern evident throughout the post-production process, in which Nolan and his key collaborators consistently chose to complete the film according to the creative vision already established during production, treating fidelity to the original artistic intent, developed in close creative dialogue with Ledger's performance, as the most meaningful way to honor his contribution to the finished work. The marketing campaign for The Dark Knight stands as one of the more studied examples of unconventional film promotion in modern studio history, and understanding why it took the elaborate, interactive form it did requires starting with the specific problem it was designed to solve. Rather than functioning as a conventional awareness campaign meant simply to build anticipation for an already well-regarded franchise, the marketing effort, developed in partnership with the alternate reality game studio 42 Entertainment, was initially conceived with a much narrower and more defensive purpose in mind, countering the considerable public skepticism that had greeted the announcement of Heath Ledger's casting as the Joker, and carefully managing exactly when and how audiences would first see his interpretation of the character. Nolan's involvement in shaping this priority reflects how seriously the production took the casting controversy, treating the marketing campaign not as separate from the film's creative concerns but as an extension of them, a tool for managing audience perception with the same deliberateness that governed decisions about cinematography, score, or screenplay. This defensive origin gives the campaign's eventual scale and ambition an interesting context. What became one of the most celebrated marketing efforts in film history began, at least in part, as damage control, an attempt to reshape a narrative that had turned skeptical before a single frame of Ledger's performance had been publicly seen. The success of the eventual campaign in transforming public sentiment stands as a testament to how effectively an unconventional, immersive approach to promotion can shift audience expectations when a more conventional publicity push might have struggled to overcome established skepticism. Building the campaign from comic book sources. In developing the specific structure and tone of the alternate reality game, 42 Entertainment drew directly on both the finished screenplay and several significant works from Batman's comic book history, including Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, the limited series exploring Batman's relationship with Dent and Gordon known as The Long Halloween, and the acclaimed graphic novel Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, published in 1989. This grounding in specific comic book source material gave the marketing team a rich thematic vocabulary to draw from, allowing the campaign's various puzzles, websites, and real-world events to feel meaningfully connected to Batman's broader mythology rather than existing as generic promotional gimmicks disconnected from the character's established fictional universe. The campaign was structured to unfold gradually across an extended period, paced deliberately around the calendar of annual holidays and cultural events throughout the year leading up to the film's release, a structural choice that allowed the marketing effort to maintain sustained audience engagement over many months rather than concentrating all of its energy into a compressed period immediately before release. Not every idea generated during this creative process ultimately survived studio approval, however. Warner Brothers rejected several concepts 42 Entertainment proposed, including a plan involving Joker-themed depictions of Santa Claus timed around the Christmas holiday, a considerably darker concept involving coffins filled with mechanically chattering teeth planned for release around Mother's Day, seemingly designed as a pointed reference to the murder of Bruce Wayne's own mother, and a proposal to station costumed Batman performers on rooftops in various cities, an idea the studio declined due to legitimate concerns about the safety risks such a stunt might pose. These rejected concepts offer a useful window into just how far 42 Entertainment was initially willing to push the campaign's dark, provocative tone, and the studio's willingness to rein in certain ideas illustrates the careful calibration required to make an unconventional marketing approach feel appropriately edgy without crossing into genuinely reckless or offensive territory. The Pixel reveal and I Believe in Harvey Dent. The alternate reality game formally began in May 2007, more than a year before the film's eventual theatrical release, with an early phase built around campaign materials designed to look like official political endorsements for Harvey Dent's district attorney campaign within the film's fiction, alongside modified playing cards bearing the Joker's imagery and the phrase, "I believe in Harvey Dent," a piece of ironic messaging given the character's eventual fate within the finished story. These materials were deliberately hidden inside comic books distributed through stores across the United States, creating a genuinely participatory discovery experience for fans who might stumble upon these hidden materials during ordinary purchases rather than through any conventional advertising channel. Fans who discovered these materials were directed to an accompanying website that invited them to submit their email addresses in exchange for the gradual revelation of a single pixel from a larger, initially concealed image of the Joker. This crowdsourced reveal mechanic required a substantial collective effort to complete. Ultimately, approximately 97,000 individual email addresses were submitted over a period of roughly 20 hours before the full image was finally revealed in its complete form. The gradual, collaborative nature of this reveal generated considerable audience engagement and was received enthusiastically by participants, functioning as an early and highly effective demonstration of how interactive, participatory marketing techniques could generate sustained anticipation in a way a traditional single-image poster release could not replicate. Dollar bills and an unexpected crowd. At San Diego Comic-Con, one of the entertainment industry's most significant annual gatherings for fans of comic books, film, and related media,